The system showed an icon with Myungwoo, which crashed. It told Yujin that, for example, people believe that the F class is hard to grow up no matter how hard you try, but there are those around him who have already destroyed this stereotype. The protagonist watched the system carefully. Pursing his lips, the system noted that nothing is set in stone, neither characteristics nor skills, adding that people are destined to change. The protagonist opened his mouth slightly in surprise. The main character grabbed a smiling pink emoticon with both hands. Yujin angrily widened his eyes and bared his teeth. Clutching a pink smiley face in his hands, the main character told the system to first change the code word. The protagonist contorted his face with frantic anger. Glaring angrily at the system, Yujin told the system that if they were going to entrust him with an important mission, then they shouldn't have given such a crap word. The system asked Yujin to calm down. The main character imagined himself among his friends, where he had to fulfill the mission of confessing his love. The protagonist angrily swore at the system, asking that he needs to influence 50 people, and they invite him to confess his love to them all, noting that it looks like some kind of game. A blue smiley face appeared in front of the angry protagonist. He told Yujin that they couldn't choose a code word, adding that they were just testing his skills and writing down his name and explanation. The protagonist told the system that the code word wouldn't be so terrible if they explained every. Yujin imagined a happy Myungwoo, receiving everything he needed. The main character looked intently at the pink smiley face. A green smiley appeared behind the protagonist. He told the main character that this is all because the skills were taken from information about the past world. Various creatures appeared around the main character. The system noticed that Yujin had already noticed the existence of other universes. The system imagined a forge with the fire spirit Ismuar. The system told the protagonist that the gold forge was created from outside and sent to his world. A pierced heart with a dagger bled onto the crystal. Against the backdrop of a blue dragon, Myungwoo stood with flowers against the background of a golden forge. The system noted that it was very rare to send such value there, because the previous owner of the skills used his power, sacrificing his life for the sake of the future of others. The system presented gray cards with pictures of rabbits. The system told the protagonist that they usually write down all the information jumbled together, such as writing the classification of a new animal based on already known ones, adding that even so there are inaccuracies and they have no POW. A red icon with a skill appeared in front of the main character. The system told the protagonist that this was also the first appearance of the ideal educator. Red perfect caregiver skill icon, proof that you have raised a person who has become one of the strongest in the world. The abilities of the teacher have become even more ideal due to the improvement of your. The system's pink and green smileys floated in the air. The green smiley said that the title of educator itself is quite rare, and in order to gain the skill, he must be recognized as an educator by a Born S class. The main character asked the system about the Born S class. The system recalled the moment when the main character looked at Shion Han's face. The system told Yujin that he had used a cutting. The system recalled Yerim holding a weapon in her hands, surrounded by ice. The system noted that most often the awakening of an S class becomes possible under the condition between A and S. And this means that you can become both an S class and an A class, depending on the environment, adding that th. The system presented the image of Yukon and Hyoni, with system windows above their heads. Possible awakening level S class. The system noted that they are extremely rare, only a few people exceeding the abilities of the rest. The system imagined 3 Greek gods. She said that being so superior, more often than not they cannot get along with others, and ordinary people, even their parents, often tend to feel uncomfortable around them. Yujin looked down in confusion, his mouth slightly open. The system said that this is why the title of educator is so rare. The main character thought that he had never felt uncomfortable in the presence of his brother. An image of Greek gods fighting among themselves. The system noticed that educators do not live long, and sometimes they even become victims instead of the natural S class, adding that the difference in power is high, so patronage of this class can turn into cruelty. The system's pink smiley smiled widely, saying that they hoped that the main character would successfully collect all the S classes. The protagonist raised his head, looking at the system emoticons. The system told Yujin to just take it slow and not put himself in danger for 5 years. The pink smiley face gradually began to disappear. The pink smiley began to explain that upon completion of this test, something should happen, but the smiley's speech stopped there. The main character turned his head, looking at the disappearing emoticons. The system told the protagonist that their time was up, adding that they were sending him back, and not much time should have passed, thinking that about 30 minutes had passed. The protagonist widened his eyes in surprise, his mouth wide open. A vortex of blue energy began to form under the protagonist's feet. Eugen asked the system he could tell his brother about this. Noting that he was very worried about him, and they could just send him a message, the system told the main character that he could not say everything, but only that he w. The funnel of the system began to suck in the body of the main character. Eugen realized that the dungeon generation rule remained the same. So he was going to explore it. The system responded that it remained the same, noting that there would be instances of dungeons from the future appearing. But the protagonist opened his eyes wide in surprise and knitted his eyebrows, raising his hand to his face. The main character wanted to ask the system about monsters. The system told the main character not to worry, because he would find out about everything, even if he didn't want to. And the time wool. Eugen appeared in the sky, having escaped from the system. The main character was lying on the ground, looking up in bewilderment. The protagonist suddenly jumped up from the ground, looking around the dungeon in shock. He was worried about what was happening to his brother. Huge clouds of smoke rose up around Eugen, and the entire forest was on fire. The main character was going to hurry up and explain everything and calm down Eugen. The protagonist looked at the burning forest with numbness and a nervous smile. All the land and trees were scorched. Eugen did not understand where he was because there was a forest in his dungeon. The monster's huge paws rushed along the ground towards the main character. Eugen thought that the system had accidentally sent him to another place, to some low-level dungeon. Eugen looked behind him in fear, his mouth parted. The enraged Peace bared his teeth and rushed at the main character. The protagonist, not recognizing Peace, thought that this monster was definitely not low-level. Eugen jumped aside from the blow of the enraged Peace. The main character looked at Peace with horror. His eyes wide, he didn't understand how he could cope with it. The protagonist's eyes glowed blue. The main character looked at his angry pet through the system window with his characteristics. Eugen's hand suddenly grabbed the main character. The protagonist did not understand how this monster turned out to be Peace. Eugen threw Eugen over his shoulder, causing him to widen his eyes in fear. Eugen grabbed his brother's coat with his hand, looking at him in surprise. The protagonist gazed at his brother's serious face. Eugen asked Eugen what he was doing there. The main character turned his head towards Peace, behind which a purple fire was raging. Eugen noticed that for now they were in a forest dungeon. The protagonist lay on Eugen's shoulder and looked around as the entire forest dungeon was engulfed in purple flames. Eugen continued to walk forward, carrying his brother on his shoulder. As Peace walked humbly behind them, Eugen tried to calm his brother down and told him to let him go. Eugen clenched his fist and replied that he couldn't remain calm in such a situation. Peace looked disdainfully towards Eugen and snorted. The main character told his brother that he would explain everything to him, and at the same time turned to his pet to stop his angry little brother. Eugen frowned deeply and bared his teeth. The main character began to make excuses with the understanding that Eugen would be worried. Eugen snapped back that he didn't care and told his brother to just shut up so he wouldn't have to forcefully shut him up. Eugen frowned deeply and turned to the side, asking ironically that Eugen really wanted to drive him crazy. Eugen, lying on his brother's shoulder, cast a questioning glance. The entire forest dungeon was ablaze with violet flame. The protagonist tried to speak out, but Eugen did not want to listen to him. Eugen continued to follow his path. Eugen thought that he just needed to wait a little longer since Eugen said he could handle everything alone. The main character also said that he believed that he could relax and not worrying about it. Eugen grabbed his brother's hand tightly and was very angry with him. Eugen threw his brother to the ground, causing him to close his eyes tightly. Waving his arms to the side, Eugen explained that he no longer had any other choice. Eugen held out his sharp sword in front of Eugen's face, who looked on in sweat. Eugen glared at his brother and held a sword with a purple aura in front of the protagonist's face. Eugen noted that he would simply tell the others that Eugen died in this dungeon. Eugen looked dumbfounded at his brother, who was holding a sharp blade in front of him. Eugen added that too much could happen if Eugen were left alive. The corpse of a huge monster, similar to a griffin, lay on the smoldering ground. Eugen noted that he could convince others that Eugen died because of the dungeon boss, even though some would not believe that he could not protect his D-class dungeon brother. Eugen ran the blade of his blade across his frightened brother's shoulder. Eugen added that an arm or a leg would be excellent evidence to the contrary. Eugen imagined two warriors in golden armor fighting each other. Realizing that the patronage of the S-class could turn into cruelty, Eugen replied that although it would be painful, he would protect Eugen from now on. Yu Yun raised his blade into the air and glared at his brother. Yu Yun told his brother to be patient for a moment because he would instantly heal him with a potion. Yujin was shocked and his eyes widened. Yu Yun tried to thrust the sword into his brother, but the system shield prevented him from doing so. The main character suddenly jumped up and ran to the side, angrily turning back at his brother, calling him a psycho. The protagonist tried to grab to system blades. Looking back angrily, Yu Hyan understood that, if Yu Hyan really wanted to do this, he would have already lost his arm. The protagonist understood that Yu Hyan still had doubts. Yu Hyan displeasantly asked his brother how he could be grateful to him for. The main character released 2 daggers towards his brother, who was preparing for this attack, and swung his sword. Yu Hyan looked at his brother angrily as he parried Yujin's dagger attack. With his sword, Yu Hyan noted that the protagonist still had no thoughts of staying by his brother's side. Yu Hyan grabbed his brother's shirt while holding his sharp sword with a purple aura. Yu Hyan angrily pointed out that his older brother had been hiding information from the very beginning. Yujin held the blue pendant in his hands and raised it into the air. Yujin told his pet to stop his little brother. Peace immediately became furious and grew in size, trying to attack Yu Yun. Peace bloodthirstily grabbed the hand of Yu Yun, who glared at him. Yu Yun noticed that this option with the beast could not work. Yu Yun moved his hand to the side and struck Peace on the head with the hilt of his sword. With a deft movement of his hands, Yu Hyan knocked the huge and ferocious Peace to the ground. Peace lay unconscious, his tongue hanging out of his mouth. Yujin, frightened for his pet, rushed to his aid, trying to call him. Yu Hyan swung his arm and knocked Yujin to the ground. Yu Hyan gripped the hilt of the blade tightly and raised it into the air above his head. Yu Hyan noted that it would be better this way. Bright fragments of matter scattered in the air. Yu Hyan deliberately missed with his blade and stuck it into the ground, next to the head of Yujin, who looked dumbfounded at what was happening. Yu Hyan bowed down in front of his brother and looked at him carefully. Yu Hyan said that he liked everything and thought that they had made peace and everything was back to normal. Yu Hyan tried not to notice anything, even if something seemed strange to him. Therefore, Yu Hyan asked his brother if Peace lay lifeless on the destroyed ground. Yu Hyan also recalled the fiery horn Peace, asking the protagonist if he really received the skill to tame magical beasts at level 10. Yu Hyan explained that Yujin would not mess with the beast, knowing how much effort it would take. Yujin looked at the blade angrily, pursing his lips. Yu Yun reminded the main character of Manhwa and Peepo. The protagonist looked up in surprise at his brother, his mouth slightly open. Yu Yun said that he didn't care what happened outside the dungeons, but for some reason something happened every time he entered the dungeons, even this time. Yu Yun dropped his head and opened his mouth slightly. He said he has no idea what's going on, and there's nothing he can do when the main character goes missing. Yu Hyan looked at his brother with a sad expression, causing his eyes to fill with tears. Yu Hyan didn't understand how he was supposed to deal with all this. Yujin fell to the ground and looked dumbfounded at his brother, who was holding his head. Yu Hyan said that he still didn't think he could take his arm, but he could take some blood or a piece of flesh. Yu Hyan tried to free his sword from the ground as the main character lay underneath him, his eyes wide in shock. Yu Hyan looked at his brother with contempt as he tried to reach for his sword. Yujin ordered not to do this, but the younger brother noted that he would immediately cure him. The main character looked at what was happening in rage and anger and shouted to the system about how long it would last because his brother practically touched his face with a purple sword. Yu Hyan swung his sword as a blue system window appeared between him and his brother, emitting a blue aura. Yu Hyan looked ahead in amazement. Yu Hyan clutched the sword in his hand and looked dumbfounded at the blue system window. Yu Hyan watched as Yujin fussed and ran from place to place. Yu Hyan didn't understand what came out in front of him. Yujin hurriedly notified his brother that he was going to explain everything quickly. Yujin cleared his throat lightly as Yu Hyan looked at the system window in shock. The main character said that everything was exactly as Yu Hyan thought, because when he saw Peace for the first time, he decided to raise him, noting that he actually received an S-class skill. Yu Yun listened in amazement as Yujin explained that he had gone into dungeons several times and ended up with Peepo. Yujin shyly peeked out from under his bangs, sitting on the ground and holding his head. Yujin explained that this all happened thanks to the system and he secretly helped its creator. Yu Yun looked at his brother worriedly and opened his mouth. The protagonist noted that he was going to tell his brother about this, which is why he requested messages. Yu Hyan began to go over the words spoken and tried to understand the essence of what was happening. Yujin got angry at his brother and punched him in the face as hard as he could. Yu Haiyan didn't understand why the system chose him. He was constantly being forced to do something dangerous. Yujin replied that it was Yu Haiyan himself who constantly exposed him to danger. Yu Haiyan, after such a blow, held his hand as he was injured, realizing that the S-lass had a hard head. The main character glared at his brother from under his long bangs. He explained that he did not hide all this because he could not trust his brother. Yu Haiyan opened his eyes in trepidation and looked back at his brother. Yujin explained that the only one he trusted the most was his brother. Yujin bowed down in front of Peace's lifeless body while his brother was watching everything that was happening. Yujin noted that if Yuyan calmed down, he asked him to give a healing potion for Peace. Yujin held a pot of magical green stones in his hands and used one of them for Peace. Yujin went on about how Yuyan must have been worried about him all this time. Yuyan leaned forward slightly, leaning on one hand to watch as the main character tried to revive Peace with a potion. The protagonist noted that he was sure that Yuyan might have been worried because of the security measures at the entrance. But everything was fine with them, the main character added. Yu Haiyan became slightly sad and looked at his sitting brother, noting that his skills were too strange. Yujin looked sadly at the system window. He understood that he could not tell Yu Haiyan about the impact or the last gratitude. Besides, it was impossible to talk about the past. Yujin looked at his brother peacefully, stroking the animated Peace. The main character approached Yuyan and told him not to hesitate to ask questions if he was interested in something. Peace, with embarrassment, began to lick his joyful owner when Yuyan was not indifferently watching everything that was happening. Yujin noted that Yuyan might have been confused because he received too much information. Yujin also said that he really hid a lot from Yuyan. Yuyan looked sadly at his brother under the bright light. Yujin told his brother not to worry about anything anymore. Yuyan lowered his eyes in pain. Yujin added to his speech by saying that if Yuyan was worried, he should have just asked directly. Yuyan closed his eyes and lowered his head when Peace was between his brothers and purred with tenderness. Yuyan apologized for his behavior and said that he thought Yujin didn't trust him. Yujin breathed a sigh of relief and looked at his brother in awe. He believed that it would be enough to simply help his younger brother, but he understood that his responsibilities would not end there. Yujin extended his arms towards his brother to hug him. Yujin understood that if he were towards his brother to hug him, Yujin understood that if he were in his brother's place and he disappeared, then he, too, would not find a place for himself. Yujin hugged his brother tightly with Peace between them. The main character apologized to his brother and asked him about the fact that Yu Haiyan was afraid that he disappeared at the moment. Yu Haiyan also began to apologize in response and admitted his guilt. Peace looked up, purring from the brother's tight embrace. Yujin told Yuyan not to worry about it and hugged him even tighter. Yujin, standing opposite his brother, widened his eyes and spread his arms to the sides when he saw that the fiery Peace had shrunk in size. He didn't understand why did his beast shrink, although just recently it had just grown. Yu Haiyan looked down on his brother, who looked a little surprised at his pet, whose eyes shone with affection. Yu Haiyan, with his hands in his pockets, noted that Peace will become larger when necessary. And it did not increase on purpose. Yu Haiyan added that Yujin wouldn't be able to hug his pet if. The protagonist picked up his pet Peace, who lay contentedly and purred in his arms. The main character ironically addressed his beast, telling him that he should at least warn him when he is about to grow again. A woman's hand reached out through the system's blue screen, and the system's character watched as Yujin glared at his brother menacingly. The main character told his brother that he didn't level up as a result and told Yuyan to apologize to Peace for hitting him before leaving through the blue wind. Yujin held his Peace by the paws when Yuyan lowered his head in shame and began to apologize to his pet, to which Yujin reacted extremely sharply since he did not like such apologies. A system character in the form of a girl with long white hair watched with a thoughtful look as her assistant stood near the blue system window and poked her fingers at it. The head of the system noted that everyone had already taken care of this, to which the assistant replied that this was unlikely. The head of the system stood behind his assistant, who was sitting at the system control panel. The assistant asked the head about whether Yujin's younger brother, calling him sweet, was dangerous to them. The chapter noted that Yuyan had already saved the main character once, risking his life. The head pulled her hand out in front of her and spread her fingers out to the sides as another assistant in a white dress sat nearby. In her bush behind her, the head noted that if sweet Yujin raises his brother well, he will become his reliable protector. Assistant number 2 was slightly surprised. The head of the system crossed her arms and turned her gaze back towards the other assistant, answering her that there would not be enough time for the blacksmith to grow. Assistant number 2 was slightly saddened. Another system character with the skin of a white wolf on his body was walking up the stairs. He noted that Yuyan should have been sent to the next world if their current one collapsed. The head of the system, puzzled, turned back to her assistant, who was sitting at the control panel. Lightly touching her face, the assistant asked about Yujin. Noting that if they failed, then he too should be sent to the next world, the head of the system replied that she would very much like this. The guys from the system noticed that Yujin, the protagonist, would probably refuse, especially if they forced him to leave, he would fall apart. The assistant looked carefully at the system screen and noted that this seemed very wrong to her. The system character involves clothing. Moved his hand to the side, in which there was a glass of drink, and looked up at the assistant. He noted that this option in any case sounded much better than not. Another hero of the system, with horns on her head, walked up the stairs with a glass of drink and added that they would have to give up some little things for the sake of the common good. The horned character raised his hand into the air and picked up a bone-shaped jug of wine. As drops of wine floated in the air, he noted that this would also be good for the assistant at the control panel, since she would be promoted from a novice position. A bone-shaped bottle poured wine into the assistant's glass. The assistant with horns on her head said that for now it would be worth decorating sweet Yujin's room. One of the system characters raised a glass of wine in front of the blue system screen, which depicted two brothers. They were going to have fun while waiting for the fateful hour. The characters of the system made a toast to the immoral imprisoned children. We were transported back to the big city. The main character felt that everything went very smoothly after his return. The protagonist looked joyfully at his younger brother, who was holding a bouquet of flowers in his hands. The main character felt that he and his brother became more comfortable with each other. Hyujin was in the gym playing with his pet, throwing him a blue ball. Hyujin realized that his pet piece continued to grow well. Haein looked at the folder with the image of the peace beast. With slight bewilderment, Hyujin noted that Union collected the documents. Haein glared at Hyujin with her hands on the table. The main character asked Haein that something might be missing. Haein sharply replied that this information was enough because it was much more significant than what she had with her. Haein picked up the paper with the image of peace and cheered happily. As a pleased Hyujin looked at her from the side, Haein noted with delight that she had never had such high quality and in such quantity in such a short time. She also added that even the Hunters Association did not do that much for H. Haein continued to carefully study the document with a smile on her face. She noted that it was a very useful document. Because there was a limit to how many documents she could get on her own, she also added that her uncle said that he would help build a research center, noting the feeling that if it. The main character extended his hand forward. Palm up, he said that he had a special offer for Haein just for this occasion. Haein, holding the document in her hands, looked perplexed at Hyujin, who began to tell her about the proposal. He said that he would provide her with a research center next to the building for growing monsters and noted that anyone could freely use the results of the research. Haein looked at Hyujin with admiration, and all the protagonist continued that he could also recruit several assistants by asking Haein for an opinion. Haein exclaimed that this was a very great idea. Looking at Hyujin sitting quietly with his eyes closed, she also didn't understand why Hyujin wanted to help her so much. The main character explained that Haein must understand that research for world peace deserves this amount of help. Haein looked at Hyujin with admiration, closing her mouth as the main character introduced planet Earth. Haein picked up her phone and walked closer to Hyujin, who she wanted to show something to. Haein asked if she could bring her friends, to which the protagonist noted that they had to be laboratory workers and was going to look at them. Haein showed a joint photo with her joyful colleagues. She explained that this was a second-year research group for the study of dungeons and awakened ones. She also added that if she told them that they could all work together, they would immediately fly to her. The main character looked at the screen in surprise as Haein pointed at the phone. With an admiring face, she said that in their group, there was a special guy named Jaden who was extremely interested in the awakened ones. Hyujin realized that these were the dungeon people. The main character represented a company of scientists led by Haein, which was moving forward. He understood that this was supposed to be the team that would discover the law of creating dungeons in the future. Hyujin carefully examined the photo on his phone. When Haein looked at the protagonist in surprise, he turned to Haein. Hyujin looked up sarcastically towards Haein and gave a thumbs up. He greeted his new colleague, telling her to bring all her scientists. Haein exclaimed with delight that Mr. Hyujin is the best. Haein and Hyujin shook hands firmly, and an agreement was reached. The research center was undergoing rapid construction. Hyujin understood that this was a very important investment. The main character, together with his beast on his shoulder, looked back through the large window at the building. He knew that if the number of dungeons increased, As the system said, then it was only a matter of time before the building collapsed. Even if he became its owner, the protagonist understood. Yujin pressed his finger on his phone to buy shares in cash. Yujin sarcastically looked up and smiled sarcastically. Pressing his phone to his face, he decided to spend the remaining money on shares in a company that would successfully develop a cure for hair loss in a few months. Yujin also understood that these shares would go to waste, but this would still age. The company's workers watched as a huge loading crane unloaded huge containers. The most important thing for Yujin is to collect S-classes. Yerim, accompanied by Hyuna and Soyeon, extended her hand upward in greeting to her guardian. Yujin stood with his brother outside the loading dock fence, and the girls began to approach them. Yujin noticed Yerim and thought she was about to leave, but returned with others. She waved to Yujin and said that she was spending time with her sisters. Hyuna looked away with a malicious grin as Yerim pointed furiously and enthusiastically at her phone. Yeon replied that she gave advice as a hunter to her younger Yerim. Yerim explained that she received many recommendations for good restaurants. Yeon held his phone in his hands and dissatisfiedly. Yeon held her head with her hands and asked if the three monsters got there okay. Yeon noted that these monsters were still being unloaded since the ship had just arrived. Hyuna cast a haughty glance towards Yeon as she raised her hand up. Hyuna walked closer to Yujin with a grin and covered her mouth with her hands so that others wouldn't hear. Hyuna asked Yujin if he was okay. The main character looked up enthusiastically and clenched his fists. He noted that a lot had happened to him, but nothing terrible happened to him, and everything was fine with him. Hyuna didn't know what was wrong, but she felt that Yujin seemed a little distant. Hyuna hugged Yujin's head tightly, causing Yujin to widen his eyes and spit out saliva. Hyuna noted that since everything was fine with Yujin, she asked him for one of the three new monsters. Hyuna squeezed the main character in her tight embrace and covered his mouth with her hand. Yujin noted with ear. The enraged little brother glared furiously at Hyuna, who was clutching his brother. She was taken aback that the highest class monster would still go to Yujin. So she asked to borrow the monster at least sometimes, because it would be beneficial for both of them. Yujin noted to his brother that Yu, the main character, was in Hyuna's arms, and they were looking at each other with a smile. When Yujin's hand was grabbed by Soyeon, the protagonist noted that this condition was easy to fulfill because Hyuna is their favorite client at that very moment. Soyeon turned to Yujin. Soyeon looked at Yujin with a pitiful look and held his hand. She really wished there was room for her too. Hyuna continued to squeeze Yujin with one hand, breaking into a smile as Soyeon continued to hold the protagonist's hand. Soyeon asked Yujin if he would still raise her baby despite the fact that he himself would have three new ones. Yujin replied that he would do so. Yerim watched with curiosity as Yujin fooled around with Hyuna and Soyeon. Glowing with happiness, Yujin understood that the F classes were dying here because these people were too strong. The protagonist broke into a satisfied smile and closed his eyes. Lost in his imagination, he already felt that his strength was running low, and he wondered if he could handle 50 or more S-classes. Hyun fell to the ground and braced himself with his hands, turning towards his brother, who knelt down in front of him. Hyun turned to his older brother. Hyun extended his hand, and Hyun handed him the yellow pendant. Hyun sat next to his brother and squeezed his hands. Hyun said that it was a transfer item, and once the cultivation facility opened, people would come from abroad. Hyun thought that this item will definitely be useful to his older brother. Hyun timidly looked away and scratched the back of his head. He explained that from now on, he will not stop him. Even if he worries, the Abyss Guild Master noted that his younger brother would tell him whenever he needed help with anything, so he wouldn't overwork himself. Hyun responded with trep. Hyuna, on awe, and Yerim looked with disgust at the brotherly declaration of love as the main character looked at his brother enthusiastically and warmly. Pressing his hand to his chest, Yujin felt that people change greatly when problems are solved with words, noting that he will do his best on his ow. The loader guys unloaded the last container, and one of the workers noted that the cages with monsters had been unloaded. Yujin looked forward with elation, his hand on his knee as his younger brother stood behind him. Yujin told the guys that they had to go, realizing that he could not leave the world to its fate. The door of the huge van began to open. Inside the container body were wooden boxes with monsters. Yujin knew that he had to do everything possible so that he and his brother could live a good life. Bright glowing eyes appeared from the iron cage, in front of which lay someone's bone. The worker, sweating, grabbed his cap and said that these were the owner's tokens. One of the workers negotiated with Yujin and shook his hand as other workers tried to unload the container from the truck. The chief worker noted that it would not be easy for the Yujin company to raise monsters. The chief worker looked ahead with horror and shame and noted that a disaster had happened along the way. The rest of the workers looked in horror into the dark space of the van. As strong gusts of wind came from there, people realized that one of the monsters seemed to have gotten out. A strong ball of wind in the form of a tornado came from the van. The powerful beak of the monster appeared. A huge monster with the wings and face of an eagle flew out of the van. Yujin, in the company of his brother and Soil, raised their heads up, shielding themselves from the strong gust of wind, realizing that it was Griffin. Griffin's silhouette was on the emblem with gold on the red background of the flag, who was an animal from legends, having the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle. It was a monster that had appeared since the dungeons opened. Griffin floated in the air, causing the workers to run away in horror, and the Yujin company watched the animal with interest. Huna noted that it was likely that there were no other monsters capable of handling Griffin, so she thought it would be a good idea to ride him. Soyoung added that for her th. Griffin looked down predatorily, flying in the air. The main character was holding a blue crystal in his hands and looking up at Griffin with a puzzled expression. Notice that the title of Ideal Educator added an effect to the owner's sign. Griffin looked at the guys furiously and headed towards them, pulling out his sharp claws. The protagonist widened his eyes in numbness, holding blue stones on ropes. Yuhyan glared angrily at Griffin advancing towards them, trying to save his brother by grabbing onto him. Griffin landed on the ground and immediately calmed down as all the guys watched in panic as Yuhyan tried to revive his brother. Yirim shouted that they would need a potion here. Griffin lay on the ground and looked around in bewilderment while workers unloaded another cage. Griffin immediately became angry and looked to the side angrily, opening his beak. Griffin soared into the air and was about to attack the workers who were moving the cage. Yirim angrily cast her gaze towards what was happening and understood that something bad was about to happen. Huna looked at Griffin annoyed and raised her hands in front of her, about to use her red aura magic, knowing that she couldn't let Griffin fly away. Huna raised her hands in front of her and sent a red magical aura into the air towards Griffin. Huna looked in bewilderment at how Griffin was able to escape the influence of her magic without much effort. At that same second, Yirim soared into the air with the help of her blue aura, which appeared in the form of wings. Huna angrily pointed her finger in the air, noting that Griffin should have wind resistance. Even though he was still small, Yirim replied that she would grab him herself. Yirim flew in the air in a daze and tried to furiously catch the little wretch Griffin, who was flying confusedly in space. Yirim closed her eyes in horror and screamed when he was hit in the face with a wing. Huna waved her arms in the air as she watched Yirim desperately try to catch Griffin. Huna didn't understand what Yirim was doing. As an S-class, Yirim ironically replied that she did not understand what to do with Griffin's wings. Since she had never even caught a dove in her life, Yirim thought it W. Workers scattered in different directions as Griffin flew past them. Huna replied that this would be a bad idea, since Griffin could die from the cold. Soyeon also tried to help the guys. Taking with her a thick piece of fabric, she screamed for them to use the cloth that was made from a byproduct from the dungeons. Yirim noted that this was a great idea, and the fabric floated into the air. A minute later, in the thick of the pink clouds, it was already calm, and the sounds of Griffin could be heard. The little animal was wrapped in thick fabric and was beaming with happiness. Exhausted and tired, the girls were glad that they were finally able to catch Griffin, who was being held by Soyeon in a thick cloth, sitting on the ground. Huna, sweating, looked displeasantly at Griffin, who was being held by Soyeon. With a tired look, Huna noted that it would have been much easier for them if they had hunted him. Soyeon responded with a hint of despair that she was no longer sure that such a monster was even possible to tame. Soyeon continued to hold Griffin in her hands as Yirim and Hyena stood next to her, at the same time as the workers climbed out from under the rubble of the mayhem caused by the flying beast. The guys recalled the situation when these creatures attacked people. These dangerous creatures killed people and were killed in return after opening the dungeons. Suppressing their aggressive behavior and accepting them as comrades sounded like an illusion or a dream. Yuhyan looked disdainfully towards Griffin as Yujin grabbed his younger brother's hand. Yuhyan said since Griffin attacked his brother, it would be worth killing Griffin. Yujin immediately came to his senses and said that there was no need to kill anyone. The main character tried to get to his feet, holding the back of his head thanks to the help of his brother. The protagonist looked forward with a malicious grin. He logged into the system. He noted that Griffin had no ill intentions, despite the fact that his attack left him with almost broken bones. Yujin looked at the joyful little Griffin through the system window and saw all the skills and characteristics of the beast the main character thought that before they met. Griffin most likely saw only first-class hunters height requirement notice, consumption of a specific amount of magicka. Yujin put his hand on his brother standing next to him with a displeased face and turned to Soyeon. Who was holding the little Griffin? The teacher asked Soyeon to let Griffin go for a while. Yujin also added to his brother that he was standing still, to which he asked in bewilderment what Yujin was. The main character decided to reassure his friends and told them not to worry, because he was just going to teach Griffin to coexist next to them. Yujin pointed his thumb at himself with a sarcastic grin. He noted that he was the weakest person on their team. Soyeon looked at Yujin anxiously, holding the cloth-wrapped beast in her hands. As the main character began to roll up his sleeves, the protagonist noted that Griffin was supposed to be an obedient boy. Yujin extended his hand towards Griffin and told him to fly up. Griffin happily flew towards his summoner, holding out his paws with sharp claws in front of him. Griffin grabbed Yujin's hand with his claws, who tried to hide from the beast with it. Yujin immediately became gloomy and drooped. Griffin flew to the side in concern when he saw blood splattering heavily from his summoner's hand. Yujin screamed in a panic that he was in great pain and was bleeding. Griffin continued to float in the air and watch what was happening as Yujin doubled over in pain and held his wounded arm. Yujin made a point for Griffin to understand that he was not a threat to him, since he was weak. The main character stretched out his wounded hand, trying to call Griffin to himself again, and poured a healing potion into the wound. The three girls widened their eyes in horror and watched as Yujin did not give up and was about to tame Griffin, from which he received constant open wounds from which blood splattered. All the guys watched in shock as Yujin angrily looked at Griffin and tried to convey to him that he felt what real weakness was. The guys ironically thought that Yujin could be proud of his weakness. And yet, finally, at one moment, Griffin sat calmly on Yujin's wounded hand. The main character looked with delight at his beast, which he was able to tame. He praised his Griffin, saying that this is exactly what needed to be done. Griffin began to make out with Yujin, closing his eyes, causing the summoner to break into a sweet smile. Yujin continued to praise his beast, noting that he learned too quickly because he was smart. The guys surrounded Yujin and watched in delight as the beast calmly sat on his arm, satisfied with his work. Yujin turned to Yerim and invited her to hold Griffin in her arms, telling her to cover his eyes. Yerim looked at Yujin in confusion, pointing her finger at herself. Yerim looked frantically at Griffin, who was sitting on her arm, and covered his eyes. She asked if everything would be okay now, because there could be a possibility that he would fly away again. The main character turned back with enthusiasm and noted that if they close Griffin's eyes and move him the small door of the iron cage began to open little by little. Hyojin explained that the reason why Griffin became overexcited was because of what was in the iron cage. In a small dark cage, two unicorns, black and white, lay with a pitiful look. Hyojin noted that the reason lay in these shadow unicorns. Hyuna and Soyeon approached the cage and began to examine it. Hyuna noted that these two were still in the cage all this time. Yujin, standing behind them, noted that Griffin was most likely agitated due to the fact that he was in the same space with them. The main character also explained that Yujin remembered this characteristic from Griffin. Hyuna looked at Yujin with an exclamation and pointed her finger at him, to which the main character raised his finger up. Hyuna said that there was a lot of meat in their guild's dungeon and they could share it. Yujin noted that it was a good offer. Soyeon looked warmly at Hyuna, who threw her a wicked grin at her. Soyeon commented that it sounded great, to which Hyuna also agreed. The main character looked joyfully at the two little unicorns. He told them not to be afraid, because now everything was fine. The two unicorns looked up at their savior with tears in their eyes. Notification: the title of Ideal Educator adds an effect to the owner's sign. The object expresses interest in the teacher. Being a weak F class, Yujin easily did what no one else could do. Two unicorns approached the main character and began to sniff him because he put his hand in front of them. Hyuna watched closely what was happening as the main character tamed the unicorns. She understood that now the elder brother of the head of the abyss, and also the hunter Yujin, had gained even more of her trust. The protagonist looked at the white unicorn with delight and stroked his head. He ordered the unicorns to be sent to the training center, noting that they needed to be given names. It was already evening outside and the sky was covered with purple light. Yujin suggested naming unicorns by color, i.e., White and black. The guys realized that it sounded very stupid and said that they were stupid names. One of the girls noted that creativity in names was not Eugen's best trait. At the same time, in a dark space somewhere in a cave, a fighter in a black t-shirt stood on the ruins and held a man by the neck. The fighter's hand tightly squeezed the man's neck, and he tried to break free. The fighter asked if the man really wasn't aware that the bricks had bought out her contract. A bunch of human corpses were already lying on the rubble on the ground. The fighter noticed that she had placed a high-class curse on him, blinding those who violate it. She also said with dissatisfaction that someone simply tore up the contract as if it meant nothing. The fighter explained that only the man was already drooling from his mouth under such pressure and screaming that he really knew nothing about the contract and who could destroy it. The fighter held the man in the air with a strong hand. The man said that the guild leader died during the kidnapping incident. The fighter girl opened her mouth slightly, and realization dawned on her. The fighter's strong hand grabbed his neck even harder, and the man clenched his teeth in pain, spitting blood out of his mouth. He wanted the fighter to let him go. The fighter squeezed her neck tightly, thereby tearing her head away from her body. The fighter noted that it sounded pathetic, noting that if the man did not know anything, then in that case, there was no point in leaving him alive. The fighter stepped on a pile of paper and a photograph on which blood was dripping. The fighter grabbed a photo of the main character, in which he was sweetly petting his pet. The fighter was thinking that the person who bought the contract had died, and no one in the kidnapping guild knew about it. A fighter in a black t-shirt with drops of blood picked up the photograph by the edge and looked at it sarcastically. She believed that then she would have to ask the kidnapped person personally. Photos of unicorns hung on a white wall with green flowers. The white unicorn was called White and the other Black. Yerim was furiously angry and waved her arms in front of the main character, who looked at her with displeasure. Yerim was very angry, so the names of the unicorns changed a little. Joyful Griffin was flying in the air with his eyes closed. Griffin was named Blue after the color of his eyes, and he caused a stir on his first day. The protagonist tried to stop Blue, who was destroying everything in the room, throwing around a table and a bowl of food. Eugene shouted to his beast that he warned him not to spread his wings at the dinner table. The main character began to dissatisfiedly remove everything from the floor. When the joyful Blue looked around, the protagonist understood that he would have to wash the floors again, although he had just recently cleaned up. Griffin turned back in surprise and saw the overfed and tired Peace, who was sitting on the floor and holding his stomach. Blue grabbed his bowl and began to sort through the blue pieces when Eugene looked disdainfully in his direction, wiping the floor of debris. Eugene believed that Blue began to behave better thanks to Peace. The main character recalled when he and Yun watched together as an enraged Peace sorted out the relationship for dominance with Griffin. Peace effectively proved its superiority that day. Griffin, Peace and Peepo slept in their places in a deep sleep after lunch. Eugene wiped the sweat from his forehead and closed his eyes contentedly, exhaling in relief. The main character was quietly about to leave the room where the animals were sleeping. Realizing that raising children is difficult, Eugene plopped down on his large bed in slight indignation. He felt that it was very difficult for him because he would have to collect all 5 OS classes. A warm wind blew from the window and straightened the curtains as Eugene lay exhausted on the bed. The main character had almost fallen asleep and lay with his eyes closed, reasoning that he already had Peace, Peepo, Blue in his arsenal. And to more unicorns in the training center, a notification popped up saying that the dragon of poison and curses, Diovolcices, had been discovered. He also ran. The protagonist suddenly opened his eyes in bewilderment. He immediately jumped up and widened his eyes. Looking up at the pop-up notifications, Wakita's Predator skill, activated colliding with Diovalcasis, will improve skill effects by 2 times. Eugene looked at his phone screen, and it was blank. The main character noted the dragon of poison and curses, thinking that a dungeon had appeared nearby, but there were no notifications about this on the phone. Suddenly, a fighter appeared from a portal above Eugene's head and tried to take his phone from him. The protagonist looked up in shock. The fighter looked contemptuously at the frightened main character and touched his phone. The fighter climbed out of the portal completely and grabbed the phone from the hands of Eugene, who was shocked by what was happening. The fighter remarked in French that it was amazing. The fighter looked at the phone with a grin. She continued to speak in French about how Eugene was able to notice her, thinking that he was hiding some kind of unique power. Eugene sat stunned on his bed and watched the fighter with incomprehension. She replied that her translator necklace was not activated. The main character did not understand how the foreigner got into his room. thinking that it could be a dragon of poison and curses in the form of a person. The fighter girl grinned sarcastically at Yujin, raising the yellow pendant in front of her face. This girl's name was Reet, and she looked sarcastically at Yujin. Noting with irony that it was a beautiful night, Yujin realized that it wasn't awakened S-class. The protagonist looked stunned at the system window that popped up with the characteristics of Reet. He realized that it was the same S-class as his brother and Hyuni. The main character looked angrily at Reet through the system window. He knew for sure that he would not hear anything from her in the future. Reet ironically stared out the system window, and they looked at each other face to face. Reet asked Yujin what he was reading so carefully. Reet suddenly grabbed Yujin by the head and pinned him to the bed. Yujin looked puzzled through Reet's fingers, which were pressed against his face. Yujin just hummed when Reet noticed that his eyes were moving from left to right, as if he was reading something, maybe some information about her. Reet looked sarcastically into Yujin's eyes. The main character felt that Reet understood everything, noting that the same happened to the head of the Jupiter Guild. The protagonist thought that the S-classes instantly noticed this. In addition, Yujin noted that Reet was able to get past their security system very easily. Reet's hand tightly squeezed Yujin's face, who understood in such a situation that if he acted rashly, he could die. Reet kept a close eye on Yujin, who was trying to escape from Reet's grip. The main character said that if Reet had some urgent business, then they should talk in the light of day. Reet sarcastically stuck out her tongue and smiled. Reet nevertheless removed her hand from the face of the protagonist, who looked very unhappy and angry. Reet said that she was interfered with by the guilds with whom Yujin entered into a contract. The main character continued to frown at Reet, raising his hand slightly. Reet also explained that his younger brother Yun clearly warned everyone. Yujin noted that he expected this from his brother. Rai pointed her finger at Yujin's head, who widened his eyes at the movement. Rai looked intensely at the main character, continuing to poke her finger into his forehead. Rai replied that she decided to make her way in this way and find out the answers to her questions and leave. Rai held her finger to Yujin's head, who became very angry. Rai noted that the main character did not look like a regular F-class. Rai was surrounded by her dark aura and smiled maliciously, pointing her finger at Yujin's forehead. The protagonist thought that this was how he would die. Although he had only recently begun to enjoy life, he was very sad, because if he had known that this would happen, then everything would have been. Rai held her finger to Yujin's forehead and looked at him in bewilderment. Yujin closed his eyes and lowered his head in displeasure. When Reet removed her finger from his head, she asked in confusion why her magic wasn't working and why Yujin didn't feel anything. At that same second, Reet grabbed Yujin's shirt and tried to look at his body, to which the main character widened his eyes. Purple cat paw prints flew through the air. Yujin did not understand what Reet was doing, who understood that the protagonist should not have items to resist poisons and curses. Reet grinned mischievously and put one hand on her belt. Reet noted that Yujin must have had the right skill to resist. She also realized that Yujin was the one who broke the contract. The protagonist timidly grabbed his shoulder as Reet towered over Yujin and pulled out her glowing contract scroll. Yujin didn't understand what they were talking about. Reet began to explain that she had recently started a contract business using her curse skill, and all the contracts were illegal. Yujin frowned slightly and carefully studied the glowing contract. Reet replied that the treaty blinds the one who destroys it. Yujin remembered his incident when one guy held him by the neck and the contract began to evaporate in the hands of the main character. Yujin, sweating, shyly looked away as Reet looked at him arrogantly and showed him the contract. Reet said that she didn't think that Yujin would be the one to break the treaty and repel the curse. Yujin immediately replied that he was not involved and he did not understand what was being discussed. Rai put her hand to her face and smiled maliciously, looking at Yujin, as she understood that his theory needed to be tested. Rai suddenly grabbed the protagonist's hand, causing him to flinch. Rai pressed herself from behind to Yujin and pulled out a glowing contract in front of his face. She sarcastically said that it was worth testing his theory, because in the worst-case scenario, he would just go blind. Yujin screamed with the sweat of his brow for Reet to stop bullying. Reet held the protagonist's hands and broke the contract. A notification popped up stating that destroying the contract had activated the curse of blindness. Another notice that the curse of blindness has been repelled by curse resistance. The protagonist looked angrily at Riet with the contracts torn in his hands. Riet looked at Yujin sarcastically and raised her hand, noting that she knew it. Yujin shouted at Riet that she was psychotic and crazy. The protagonist grabbed his shirt and looked at Riet in fear. Yujin thought that Riet had gone crazy because she didn't know for sure that he couldn't have resistance to curses. The main character did not understand who she was and what she wanted, because he could not tell from her that she was Riet laughed with her eyes closed. She replied that Yujin should not worry, because she would not offend him. Yujin rested his hands while sitting on the bed and looked angrily at Riet, who was wearing a malicious grin. The main character said that she had just offended him, to which Riet replied that she just wanted to find out what really happened with the contract. The main character frantically looked up towards Riet. Riet explained that he was wondering if everything was okay with his curse skill, because it was a reward for destroying the boss in the missing dungeon. Yujin was sitting on his bed as Riet stood in front of him with her arms crossed. The main character asked about the missing dungeon. Riet said that if she told him everything, nothing would change, because no one would believe it anyway. The dark door to the dungeon began to evaporate. Riet noted that when she cleared the dungeon, it immediately disappeared. Yujin looked down at the same moment, puzzled, lightly touching his chin. Riet asked Yujin if he believed her and if he knew anything about it at all. Yujin replied that he knew little. Yujin remembered himself in one of the space systems. With a worried look, the main character realized that this was a system, because this was the same dungeon that was supposed to appear in 5 years. The protagonist remembered the system's words that there would be cases of dungeons from the future. Riet's strong figure arched imposingly in the space of the system. Yujin realized that he didn't know any S-class hunters in the future who use curses and poison, which meant Riet had acquired a skill that no one in the original future had. Yujin realized that the reason was that he had turned back drops of blood in the space of the system. The protagonist realized that the reward for defeating the boss of the poison and curse dungeon was this skill notification. Colliding with Dio Valkysis will increase skill effects by half. Yujin looked ahead thoughtfully as Riet looked at him with curiosity and fascination. The main character replied that it was the dragon of poison and curses, Dio Valkysis. Riet asked how Yujin knew about this. Yujin looked at Riet with anticipation and listened to her stories. The silhouette of Riet against the backdrop of a black dragon stood with a malicious grin. Yujin realized that this is why he did not receive a notification on his phone about the dragon of poison and curses, because Riet was a half-dragon, half-human who absorbed the dragon's power, becoming its embodiment. The main character realized that this was an extremely unusual incident that occurred. Riet looked at Yujin's face with curiosity as she approached him, making Yujin a little confused. Rai didn't understand where Yujin came from so smart. Rai began to flirt with Yujin and moved closer to him. As Yujin crawled backwards on the bed, Rai felt that Yujin could also be some kind of dragon. The protagonist replied with confusion that he was just an ordinary person. Rai grabbed the main character's hands and was about to pounce on him. Riet said that she smelled the scent of a fellow creature or the scent of a predator, which could also easily defeat Dio Valkysis. Yujin tried to stop Riet's advances by asking her what she was doing. Yujin recalled the battle with the Raw Cheetah's dragon, which he defeated. The main character thought that this could be due to the predator skill of Raw Cheetahs, the very king of the dragons of poison and curses. Riet flirted with Yujin's body with her fingers, who definitely thought that Riet couldn't know about his skill. Riet pushed Yujin onto the bed and towered over him. Riet explained with passion that she was no longer attracted to ordinary people. Riet looked sarcastically at Yujin, pressing his body to the bed. Riet noted that she had not had so much fun for a very long time. Yujin was confused by this situation and did not understand what Riet was going to do with him. Riet continued to press Yujin to the bed, blocking her room for maneuver with her body. The main character asked what Riet wanted to do with him. Riet closed her eyes and touched Yujin's body through her shirt with her fingers. The protagonist asked in bewilderment what Riet was up to. Riet responded to Yujin to relax and suggested that they get to know each other a little better. Riet licked her lips and came close to Yujin's face and wanted to kiss him, while Yujin looked away with great shyness. Riet said that it had been a long time since she felt the similarity of her powers with others. Yujin ruined the sweet moment by telling Riet that she couldn't get into bed without taking off her shoes. The main staff peered out from under Riet's body and pointed at her black boots, which she had not taken off. Rai looked at her boots and replied that she heard that this is not the case in Korea. Yujin timidly hid under the covers. When Rai began to crawl out of bed, Rai was slightly saddened that there was no continuation, and she explained that Yujin still should not have rejected her so coldly. The main char. Rai looked arrogantly at the main character. Towering over him, Yujin said that since Rai found out everything, she should have left already. Rai exclaimed and replied that she wanted to know something else. Rai blurred in tenderness and love and clasped her hands, looking at Yujin, who covered himself from such shining cuteness with his hand with a dissatisfied look. Riet wanted Yujin to help her raise the beast. Yujin rested his hand on the crowbar with dissatisfaction as Riet began to daydream and beamed with love for her animal. Yujin did not think that Riet would come to him with such a request. Thinking that she was too talkative, Riet noted that the main character looked contemptuously at Riet. Raising his hand near his head, he ironically noted that Riet should take the turn behind the other guilds that had already made a deal with him. Riet approached Yujin from behind and looked at him sarcastically. Putting a knife to his throat, Riet said that she already knew everything. So for this reason, she decided to sneak up to him under the cover of darkness and ask for this favor. Yujin noted with irony that Riet really knew how to as. The main character humbly looked forward and swallowed his saliva, thinking that this proposal did not sound so bad. Riet looked sarcastically down at the main character, bringing the knife to her face. Yujin realized that she was a natural-born S-class with the rank of SSS class. He realized that it was too dangerous to let her go, even if she didn't end up joining a guild. Yujin caricatured himself when he takes custody of the little chick. Riet, the protagonist, felt that if something happened, this kind of connection would serve him well, realizing that in this case Riet would be in his debt. Yujin looked attentively at Rita. Sitting on the sofa with folded hands, he agreed to Riet's proposal, stating that he had one condition. The rays of the sun illuminated a large high-rise building in the morning. Seong-hin entered Yujin's room with bags of food and drinks. He greeted the main character, telling him that he had purchased a ginseng tonic to increase his stamina. Suddenly, Seong-hin's frightened gaze caught on the main character. Seong-han looked at how Yujin was lying on the floor, and his entire room was trash. Seong-han didn't understand what happened here. Seong-han desperately ran to Yujin's body to revive him. Seong-han asked what happened that night. Yujin replied that he was exhausted because a lot had happened. Yujin's hand reached out to the turned-on phone. As a result, last night the protagonist agreed to Riet's request and agreed to secretly exchange personal messages with her. In Yujin's phone, there was a correspondence with Riet, where she wrote him all sorts of pleasant compliments. Sleepy and exhausted, Yujin looked ahead heavily. Remembering how Riet left him last night, Yujin noted that Riet did what she wanted until she left. The exhausted Yujin was picked up by Seong-hin and given him a tonic in a red package. Yujin was glad that nothing bad happened, because Rai could have easily killed him. Seong-hin helped Yujin wash his face and dried his face with a towel. The main character understood that it could have been worse, so he didn't even want to imagine if only his friends were next to him. The protagonist was sprawled out on the couch as Seong-han was cleaning the house. Myungwoo was in the forge at that moment, and his brother Yoo-hyun would not be able to both protect him and withstand the S-class poison and curses. Yujin looked indifferently at the ceiling and rhetorically wondered whether he should have used a code word against Riet. The red skill tag glowed against the backdrop of Riet's spin. Yujin thought, since the effect of the skill is doubled against poison and cursed dragons, it would have an effect if he said the phrase, "I love you," just once, but he understood that Riet was too unpredictable. The main character turned his head from side to side, thinking that he could not predict what would happen if Riet became as clingy as everyone else. Seong-han, wearing a pink apron, approached Yujin worriedly and asked him if he was okay. Yujin immediately exclaimed and replied that everything was fine with him. He just thought for a while. The main character sat down on the floor and widened his eyes when he saw the sparkling cleanliness of his room. Yujin asked Seong-han, who was sitting next to him, when he managed to restore such order. Seong-hin folded his hands and replied that he was just cleaning up a little. Seong-hin held the main character's hands and noted that he did a great job taking care of the animals. Seong-hin looked at Yujin in admiration. Removing the pink scarf from his head, Seong-hin explained that Yujin can call him whenever he gets tired, and he will immediately come to his aid. Yujin raised his eyebrows pitifully and tremblingly and looked at Seong-han, realizing that he was always ready to help him. The protagonist broke into a pleasant smile and hugged Seong-han. Glowing with happiness, Yujin told Seong-han that he loves him very much because he is so amazing. The main character understood that first it would be worth nurturing the people around him to the maximum, and Riet could wait. Yujin raised his eyebrows and looked at the pop-up notification with admiration. Seong-hin has met the minimum requirements to obtain the next class. Seong-hin looked at Yujin in bewilderment, who was squeezing his cheeks and looking at him with wide eyes. Yoo-hyun looked at Seong-han through the S-level system window. While still squeezing his face, Yoo-hyun was happy that he could finally make Seong-han an S-class. Yu Hyan after that moment held the document in his hands and looked questioningly at his brother. Yu Hyan asked if Yu Hyan could raise Seong Han's level. Yu Hyan stood in front of his younger brother's workplace and waved his arms. Yu Hyan did not understand how this was possible, to which the main character explained that was why he ran to him as quickly as possible. Yujin noted that the demands were tricky. Card with conditions for raising the level of Seong Han. Meet one of the conditions: defeat the boss of an A-class dungeon with one hit, defeat an S-class beast alone, defeat an SS-class beast with a team of less than 10 people. Yujin looked at his thoughtful brother with delight. Yu Yan thought that the last condition was the most successful of the three, but explained that SS-class beasts were only found in dungeons outside of Korea. The protagonist raised his hand and clenched his fist, noting with encouragement that the F. Yu Yan imagined Seong Han defeating the monster with a crushing blow. Yu Hyan replied that Seong Han had the same A-class attack skill, but that would not be enough to defeat the boss in one hit. Yujin looked at his brother with elation and pointed a finger at himself. Yujin said that he could help with this. Yu Hyan was slightly surprised and asked how Yujin would do this. The main character began to present a plan to make Seong Han an S-class, with the two of them cheering enthusiastically on stage. Seong Han's silhouette was wrapped in iron armor with gloves and glowed with a bright aura. Yujin noted that the first step was to equip Seong Han with everything that could increase his attack power. Yerim's silhouette sent blue energy towards Seong Han's stage. Yujin suggested using Yerim to add a Seong Han snare using a buff of the day without a shadow. A jubilant Yujin imagined how he held Seong Han's hand, and together they defeated the blue silhouette of a monster at stage 3. The protagonist suggested doubling Seong Han's attack using his skill. Yu Yan looked arrogantly at his brother's small and joyful toy. Squeezing it in his hand, Yu Hyan asked why Yujin was included in this plan. Yu Hyan held his brother's toy in his hands and looked at Yujin, who closed his eyes in displeasure. Holding the monster and Seong Han toys in his hands, Yujin explained that he also had to go. Yu Hyan noted that the main character has gone crazy. The protagonist looked at his brother worriedly. Holding Seong Han toys and a monster in his hands, Yu Hyan explained that he said everything in all seriousness. Yu Hyan offered a comparison to what Yu Hyan would say if he went into an A-class dungeon while being an F-class. Yu Hyan realized the protagonist quickly spread his arms to the sides and looked at his brother, who indifferently closed his eyes and lowered his head. Yu Hyan noted that he had a B-class shield. Yu Hyan noted that Yu Hyan himself understood perfectly well that this shield would not save him. Yu Hyan looked at his brother indignantly. Holding the toys in his hands, Yu Hyan explained that they were still talking about destroying the boss. Yu Hyan imagined Seong Han dealing a crushing blow along with Yu Hyan. Yu Hyan began to explain that Yu Hyan could only share this skill's effect when touching a person, deducing that the protagonist would have to touch Seong Han the moment he dealt the killing blow to the boss. Yu Hyan explained. Yu Hyan tried to stuff the toy into his pocket and looked out from under his long bangs towards his brother, who hung his head down. Laughing hard, Yu Yun said that the shield would not work since it would touch Seong Han. The protagonist broke into a malicious smile and took out a blue luminous bracelet from his pocket. Remembering the moment when the four of them had dinner, Yujin reminded his brother of that evening, saying that he asked Myungwoo to do something for him back then. Yujin enthusiastically held up his gold bracelet in front of his astonished face. He said it was a new shield item. Yu Hyan wondered what it was. Yu Hyan took this gold bracelet and looked at it in amazement. The gold bracelet floated in the air. It was a nameless bracelet. Class undefined, disposable. Yu Hyan's eyes widened as he watched his brother spread his arms out to the sides. With a satisfied face, Yu Yun realized that this bracelet nullifies all damage taken for 10 minutes. Wondering how this was possible, the protagonist noted that that's why he spoke that evening, so that Yu Yun would mac. Yujin put his hand on his brother's shoulder. Yujin noted that Seong Han would become an S-class tank and make his guild even more impressive, and he would take care of that himself, so it was decided. Myungwoo and Seong Han were extremely unhappy with this decision. Minwoo noted that he did not make this bracelet for such a situation. Seong Han crossed his hands in front of his face and said that it was impossible to take Yujin to such a place. The main character knew that he had to persuade Myungwoo and Seong Han for some time, and in the end, they set a date for going to the dungeon. The whole team of guys stood in front of the dark gate to the dungeon, from which a blue aura emanated. Seong Han looked at Yujin with concern as Yerim rejoiced at what was happening. Seong Han asked if the main character would be okay. Yujin's his piece in his hands and told Seong Han not to worry. Yerim noticed and agreed with Yujin's words, saying that they are still S classes and will be close. Yerim S. Hyuna donned a bright red suit and appeared with her blue bag and black glasses. Hyuna straightened her hair and looked out sarcastically through her black glasses. She asked Yujin how long they had been waiting for her. The main character noted that they enlisted the help of another S-class just in case. Hyuna looked with delight at the disgruntled beast in the hands of Yujin, who laughed slightly. Hyuna also greeted Peace, calling him a good boy, and ironically asked if he would allow him to ride. Yujin joked about whether Hyuna really dreamed of having her own mount. Yujin thought that this number of Hyuna and Yujin turned their gazes to the side in displeasure when they heard an exclamation that someone had arrived last. A foot in an expensive brown shoe appeared. It was Hyuni, who was very interested to know what the main character was up to this time. Hyuni looked out of the car and began to walk out to the guys. The Yujin boys in a large group, standing in front of the magic gate, turned their attention to Hyuni, wondering what Hyuni was doing here. The ground of the city of black golems on a class dungeon was strewn with skulls. Towers rose behind the collapsing arch. In this terrifying dungeon, there are legions of golems and immortals everywhere. This is where everything happened. Yujin sat on a red lion with white undercoat and leaning binoculars to his eyes, peered into the distance. Seongyeon stood nearby, holding a tablet in his hand, and said that the golems here are slow but strong, so their tactics are to separate them to defeat them. The brunette thoughtfully put away his binoculars. While they were standing on the cliff, an explosion was heard in the dungeon, and fragments of stones flew. Hyuna pierced the monster with her spear, shouting that they were not strong at all, but rather like soft tofu. Yerim laughed and said that these guys were too slow. Yujin, blushing with admiration, said that he could not believe that he was watching this with his own eyes, and Seongyeon said that it would take a group of a classes a week to clear this dungeon, and said that for the first time he felt sorry for the monsters. The hunters swung their weapons, killing the golems with ease. The field sparkled with flashes of attacks, and Yujin thought that even in the future, there was no team consisting of 4 S-class people, and he did not imagine that he would ever see such a sight himself. An explosion was heard on the field. The brunette turned to Seongyeon and asked with joy on his face whether it would not be easier to send S-class groups to other dungeons. Looking at what was happening, the bodyguard replied that S-classes were prohibited from entering the dungeons together. He awkwardly looked away when Yujin asked if this was really necessary for the distribution of forces in case a breakthrough occurred in some other place, and said that not only for this, the guy himself would see and understand. Yujin raised the binoculars to his eyes with curiosity. Yerim, being a damage dealer, with a look of joy on her face, extended her hand with her palm open and created a blue magic ring. Damage dealer Hyuna wielded her spear with enthusiasm. Yuyun, the damage dealer, was wielding his sword with concentration. Yerim raised her hand with a trident and shouted that she would now show a couple of skills that she had received recently. Yujin asked himself the question, is everyone really fighting alone, without even sharing roles? The short-haired girl jumped up, shooting out blue streams of energy, activating Pale Rain. Violet flames flashed on the ice-covered golems. Yuyun cut the ice flows with his sword, creating flames. The angry girl screamed, telling him not to go there because the ice would melt. Streams of wind rose around Hyena Yerin, flying from above, got burned and shouted that her wind was touching her. The long-haired girl looked back and said that she did not know that she was there and shouted at her to dodge because she is S-class. Yujin and Seongyeon looked on in confusion, aware of the complete lack of teamwork, when a cry was heard that all the golems that Yerim had frozen had melted. Looking at this with a straight face, Yujin asked if it was because they were too good individually. Seongyeon laughed awkwardly. Turning his gloomy gaze to the left, the brunette thought that this man was the most capable here. The head of the guild, Jupiter, looked at the battle with a grin. The brunette wondered incomprehensibly why he came here, but did nothing. Hue's eye glowed with splendor. Yujin thought with irritation that the blonde was dressed up in fashionable gear for going to the dungeon, and he was the only one here with an SS-class weapon and a coat. In the future, looking down on Yuyun sitting on the crumbling ground, the blonde, wearing SS-class fireproof equipment, Flame Dragon Celestia's wings, will cause a lot of trouble for the guy and defeat him. Yujin stared at the guild leader with contempt, thinking that it would be good to rip off this unfortunate coat from him and hide it. Into inventory, the blonde said that he felt his burning gaze. Turning his head sharply, Yujin laughed nervously and said that he was just very glad that the head of the guild, Jupiter himself, came to help and came all this way. The guy answered with a smile that since he had lent the dungeon to their guild, he came to visit them. The brunette scratched the back of his head and, thinking that this was the only dungeon with ideal conditions, said that they were fine, and the head could go. Suddenly, Yujin screamed in horror to shut up as the head said with a smile that it was sad because he thought that they were already at the stage where the guy trusted him, considering that he was raising his child. Hyuna looked up and, turning to Hyuni, asked what he was doing there and whether he had really come to idle. The guy haughtily closed his eyes when she screamed, asking if he wanted to work and if he had really grown old and lost all his strength. Hyun asked if it was really so difficult for them without his help. He raised his hand and fire flared above his fingers. At the same moment, an explosion was heard on the battlefield, filling everything with fire. Yujin screamed in horror, and the blonde narcissistically said that he was just helping. The smoke slowly cleared, and Yujin asked what kind of help this was. Was he really offended by the girl? But the guy answered in the negative. Pointing his hand to the place of the explosion, the brunette asked why the head did this then, how he could attack his colleague instead of the monster. Hyuni asked again with an ominous fire in his eyes. She is a colleague. Yujin opened his mouth in confusion. The smoke was cut through by the silhouette of an angrily screaming girl. Veins popped out on Hyuna's furious face. She kicked off the ground, activating the wind path. Holding a spear in her hand, the girl flew to the head, shouting that if he was going to provoke her, honestly, he should have at least had equipment of the same class with him. Yujin was confused when Hyuni moved behind the guy with an innocent expression on his face. The girl opened her eyes in horror. She flew with the spear now pointed at the innocent Yujin and could not stop. Screaming in fear, Seong-un created a shield above them. Hyuna, flying down, screamed that this stupid shield wouldn't work, so let him get out of the way. The girl grabbed the spear with her legs and shouted that she would stop. The tip slammed into the ground. The girl landed in front of the shield. The spear stuck into the ground, created cracks in the ground. The edge of the cliff broke off and fell down. Looking back at the collapsed area, Hyuna breathed a sigh of relief and said that everything was fine. Yujin and Seong-un, hugging each other, trembled with fear, and Hyunhee, clapping, innocently said that the girl had excellent control, and she, pointing her hand at him, shouted that he was a fool and it was his fault. The brown-haired girl with disheveled curls turned around when she heard a voice telling her to be more careful. His brother appeared in front of Yujin, his brown coat fluttering in the wind. The head of World's Edge frowned, looking at the girl. Approaching her, Yuyun asked if she hadn't seen his brother. How did she dare to attack? Hyuna displeasedly asked what the problem was. She had stopped. Yujin awkwardly said that she was right, and it was because of the head of Jupiter. Looking at her with a murderous gaze, Yuyun darkly asked that even if they were in a quarrel with the head, couldn't she simply not succumb to his provocations, and said that her character is simple, which is reflected in her attacks, which are so obvious that in the child will be able to dodge. Veins popped out on Hyena's face, and the enraged girl asked what he just said. The brunette grabbed his sword, saying that she was sticking her nose where it shouldn't. The girl squeezed the spear in her hand. The clash sparked between them as Hyena asked why don't they have some fun while they're here. Looking fearfully at the head of Jupiter, Yujin asked him to stop the two and asked why they kept provoking each other, and Hyuni calmly replied that nothing could be done because S-classes fight alone, not in groups. Yuyun and Hyuna crossed their weapons, causing flashes of light, and the guy said that now dungeon breakthroughs rarely happen, and asked if they were not forbidden to enter the dungeon together. Hyuni leaned his black-gloved hand against his chin and smiled sarcastically. Ominously looking at the battle with burning eyes, he said that since they were all here, this was the perfect opportunity to grab each other's throats. Yujin opened his mouth in horror. Hyuna attacked Hyen with fury in her eyes, and Yujin thought that it took a long time to convince Yerim and Hyuni to go with them, and he was surprised that the other guild heads were willing to go, although he did not reveal the true purpose. But now I understand why S-classes can't go to dungeon. Yerim, standing on the mountain of defeated golems, with joy on her face, stuck her trident into the shining blue stone in the center of the monster and said with satisfaction that she had hit a big one. The girl took the red stone and, wiping her forehead with her hand, said that she was allowed to collect magic stones here, so she would sell them and pay for all the expenses for the ice tree spear and buy new equipment. An explosion was heard from her side, and the girl turned around in confusion and wondered what they were doing instead of hunting. Hyojin, holding his head, watched in horror from the cliff as Yuyun floated in the air, holding a purple flame in his hand, and under him Hyuna created a red ball of energy in her palm. Hyojin fell to the ground in indignation and, shouting, asked what they should do, because they really began to fight. The excited brown-haired woman said with a grin that she didn't know that blue willow leaves could be used this way. Suddenly she pushed off from the ground. Jumping up, Hyuna attacked the guy with a spear, shouting that she couldn't be stopped by pathetic leaves. Seong unraised his hand, creating a shield. Yujin, cowering, stood next to him, hiding from a new explosion. The guy cleared his throat and opened his eyes slightly, thinking that someone will get hurt if this continues, but he doesn't know what he can do because he's just an F class. Yu Hyan suddenly looked up worriedly when he heard a cough. Suddenly, he jumped onto a cliff, leaving the girl alone, and asked if her brother was okay. The guy grabbed Yujin by the shoulders and carefully asked if he had inhaled the smoke, and, apologizing, said that it was his fault, while Hyuna, who had climbed onto the cliff, asked where he had gone, because they were fighting. Bringing a handkerchief to his brother's nose, Yuyun turned around and offendedly told the girl that his brother was here, so she should be more careful. Hyuna was dumbfounded and asked if Hyuni heard this. Holding a handkerchief to the guy's nose, the brunette told him to blow his nose, and he thought that there was another way, a little awkward, but effective. Yujin fell to the ground and, closing his eyes, put his hand to his head, shouting that he was dying because he was just a weak F class. Hyan Ho bashfully scratched the back of her head, and Yu Hyan leaned over his brother with a handkerchief in his hand. He screamed that the naughty S classes started fighting and scared him. Poor F class, he already had a stomachache. And now he won't be able to sleep yet, and will cry from stress. Yu Yun turned his reddened eyes, full of hatred, to the girl, pointing his hand at the lion and the man. Yujin shouted that of course they should be ashamed, because even Seong Hun and Peace behaved better. The S-class hunters hung down as they listened to the guy yelling for them not to be distracted, to finish quickly and get out of here, because they are not children and should stop fighting. The guy put a red cap on his head. He took out a gray whistle. Sitting on Peace and pointing in the direction with his hand, Yujin whistled and said that the golems were for 3 hours for high on awe and let Hyuni inspect the perimeter. Exhaling, the guy said with relief that he had to separate them so as not to fight again. A digital window appeared in front of him with the reward he received, where it was written that he had acquired the SS class skill, the terrifying chicken commander, and the description said that he was a teacher who leads the stubborn awakened ones, and although the children are naughty, there is no need to worrying if you use this skill. The guy looked at the window wondering what was wrong with the name of the skill and its description. The night sky above the destroyed dungeon was illuminated by constellations. Holding a steaming mug in his hand, Seong Hun offered it to Yujin and said that they would stop here for the night. Looking at the mesmerizing views of the gloomy night dungeon, the man said that if they continue at the same pace, they will get out of here tomorrow. Leaning against a wooden beam, Yujin looked up at the stone building above them and said that because of these buildings, it was convenient to relax here, asking Zhang if he thought there was a castle or a church. To which he replied that he was not sure, since so far I didn't find any documents. The guy brought a cup of hot drink to his lips. On the dilapidated building could be seen image of a warrior galloping on a horse and pulling the string of a bow. Yujin, looking at this, thought that according to the system, these were traces of another fallen world, where they could not cope with the growing number of dungeons due to those who imagining the collapsing multi-story buildings, the guy wondered if they would meet the same end if they failed to cope with the dungeons, if they could stop them with 50s classes, with these uncontrollable people. Screaming pitifully, Yerim said that they were all too angry. Everyone sat or stood around the fire, and the short-haired girl, laying out all the magic stones she had mined on a white cloth, shouted that they were taking away all the fun because she also wanted to fight. While wiping his sword, Yuyun asked who she could handle if she didn't have enough experience, skills, and equipment. Hyuna ran her hand over the girl's face and asked with a grin if that was why she was collecting stones so hard that she got soot all over her face when Yerim shouted that she would buy new equipment after selling the stones and smear them all. Yuyun wiped his sword with a calm expression, and Yujin smiled nervously as Hyuna asked who burned the ends of her hair. The girl was upset, holding her burnt curls in her hand, and Yerim, looking at her, said that she could just cut her hair, and asked if such long hair didn't get in the way when hunting. Running her hand through her curls, the girl replied that they were in the way, but she needed them for advertising and for those old people who sponsor her guild. Tossing her luxurious hair, Hyuna said that she was told that she should remain graceful, since she is a female S-class hunter. Yerim asked incomprehensibly what this had to do with hunting. Jumping on the girl from behind, Hyuna said that this is a good question and let her do what she wants and not worrying about such things. placing her hand on Yerim. The brown-haired girl closed her eyes and, exhaling, said that sometimes it's even more comfortable in the dungeons. Turning to the head of the Jupiter Guild, the girl said that she would like to kill all these old people and asked if they should be as independent as the head. Bringing a porcelain cup with a hot drink to his mouth, Huni said that you shouldn't be on a leash all the time. Raising his eyes upward, in which the fire of the fire was ominously reflected, the blonde said that they only think about profit, and this was the reason for the incident in MKC. Besides, those who do not know anything about high-class dungeons will not be able to understand them and will not make ho. Yujin looked at him silently, his mouth parted. Remembering the battle he saw between hunters and golems, he thought that after that he began to understand that S-classes are significantly superior to ordinary people in strength. For several days, or even weeks a month, predators dominate monsters from other worlds. Holding a thermos in her hand, Huna said with a smile that the young master is full of surprises, and she stops recognizing him when he is next to her brother. Yujin turned his gaze to his brother. Yuyun looked down. Looking down, Yujin thought he was holding back. Looking at his brother's back, he asked himself, because he is holding back not because he is kind, but does not act as he wants, because his brother is an F-class, all because of him. Yuyun looked at him, noticing that he was looking at him, and asked what was the matter. Looking at him, Yu Haiyan asked if he was tired because he didn't look very good, and Seong Haiyan chimed in, saying that the guy should rest. A rolled-up gray sleeping bag appeared in the brunette's hands, and a white pillow flew into his head when everyone told him to go to bed, and he asked how they would cope without him. A girl with short blue hair pointed her finger at herself and said that they are S-class, so for them one night is not scary. Clenching her fist, Huna agreed and said that they will continue to protect the dungeon and will hunt in twos, replacing each other. Yujin blushed with joy as he looked at the guys. Everyone shuddered when the guy, holding a sleeping bag in his hands, asked suspiciously that they had not split into two to fight. Grabbing the orange bottle, Yerim looked away when the guy noticed that there was a whole bunch of mana potions hanging on it and said that it was just because she was hungry. Yuyun awkwardly looked down, and Huna screamed at the head when the guy said that he noticed that Huni had changed his gloves and his brother was sharpening his knife all the time. Raising his index finger, Yujin sternly told them to hunt monsters and do nothing else, and if he noticed them fighting, he would tell Myungwoo everything. The guy lay down in the sleeping bag, and Yerim screamed that he had misunderstood everything. This was just her only equipment. Yujin replied that then they just shouldn't fight. Lowering his head onto the pillow and closing his eyes, the guy exhaled, thinking that it was already difficult for him with 4, but he needed 50. The star-studded night sky was glowing above him. He wondered if he could really trust the system, and thought that at this point he had no other choice anyway. And maybe if he moved forward in small steps, he could recruit 50 people and save the world. He jumped up when it was light, looking ahead in horror. In front of their team was a huge gray creature that resembled a lizard. A man in a black suit and glasses stood under the congratulatory sign and, holding a microphone to his mouth, congratulated Seong Han on his promotion, saying that thanks to this, World's Edge now has a 3rd S-class. Yujin appeared behind Seong Han with a bouquet of flowers in his hands, congratulating the man and saying that he was looking forward to continuing to work with him as a team. The discarded bouquet fell to the ground as Seong Han told him to get lost. Showing a thumbs down, the man irritably said that from this day on, he was leaving World's Edge since the S-classes did not need comrades. Yu Haiyan pulled out his sword when Seong Han shouted that he was challenging him to a duel. Haiyan grabbed the spear, and Yirim happily jumped up with a trident in her hands, shouting that they wanted to come with them too. All the S-classes rushed at each other, drawing their weapons. Yujin opened his eyes in horror, shouting for everyone to stop because the building might collapse. The guy was lying in a sleeping bag, Peace was sleeping on his back on his side, and Seong Han, sitting next to him, asked if the gentleman was okay. Jumping up, the guy screamed in horror, asking that Seong Han not go to work for himself and not get involved in fights just because he became an S-class. The man waved his hands in front of him, saying with a smile that there was no need to worry, since he would continue to faithfully serve as the shield of World's Edge, and asked why the guy woke up so suddenly, because he was sleeping sweetly. Peace licked the guy's neck, and he scratched the back of his head, awkwardly saying that it was just a dream where they were all fighting and the building was collapsing. The guy looked up, asking where the lightning came from, since there was no rain. Putting his palm to his forehead, he squinted and said that he seemed to see a flash there, and suddenly asked what happened to the lock that was there. Suddenly a bright flash appeared above them. Hyuna and Hyoni stood on opposite pillars with a sparkling golden chain surrounding them. Drops of dark liquid dripped onto the ground near the girl's leg. She crouched down, looking at her wounded hand as the guild leader said that they really needed to get back to business. Pouring a potion from a yellow bottle onto her hand, Hyuna with a smile told him to finally answer her question and asked what made him honor them with his presence. Did he really have his eye on the older brother of the head of World's Edge? The blonde looked at the girl with a malicious smile. Holding an open bottle in her hand, Hyuna said that the guy may have valuable skills, but he is only an F class, and the head said that you should never judge people by their class. The blonde with sparkling eyes smiled and asked if it was possible to just have fun for once. The girl raised the yellow bottle to her mouth as Hyoni said that the guy looked unusually fearless and surprisingly self-confident. The girl threw the empty bottle behind her back. The yellow container fell to the ground as the blonde said that there were enough reasons why he was interested in this guy. Suddenly, the long-haired girl grabbed a spear and attacked the head. The tip hit a link in the magic chain. Hyoni stopped the tip of the spear in front of his eyes with a chain. Holding the spear, the girl smiled sinisterly and said that he was a forbidden area and they didn't want Hyoni to break their precious crystal ball while he was having fun. The guy surrounded by chains jumped to the side. Raising his hand, he sighed and said that it was unexpected that the girl was not indifferent to such things. Hyoni jumped, dodging the chains flying at her, and shouted for the guy to shut up. Having destroyed the chain in front of her, the girl told him to at least wait his turn until she received the mount. Illuminated by the glow of magical chains, the blonde smiled when the girl shouted that he had already destroyed several of his toys. An explosion was heard on the battlefield. Yujin was sitting on peace and, looking up, said that the hunters were moving so fast that he could barely see them. Seong-hin asked him to stay here while he tried to talk to them. The man looked at the battlefield and froze, his mouth open. Two hunters were in the air against the backdrop of a bright flash. Shang-han looked up in fascination, thinking how amazing it looked like two S-classes fighting against each other, and he couldn't muster the courage to even come closer, let alone talk to them. Yujin shouted, placing his palms over his mouth. The hunters turned sharply at the sound. Sean looked in surprise at the guy, who with a menacing look ironically shouted that there were a couple of people with a fever who had turned the dungeon into a personal sparring hall. The S-classes landed on a cliff next to an angry guy who asked if he was unclear. Grabbing the girl by the hand, he angrily shouted that she have literally burned her sleeve. Clenching his hand into a fist, the guy angrily asked if they were really 5 years old and what would happen if they hurt themselves fighting each other. Hyuna whispered to the head that he was right, and there was clearly something about this guy there is, thinking that he doesn't even know what. Pointing his finger at them, Yujin frowned and asked if guild heads shouldn't lead by example, and don't they know that the dungeons are full of dangers. Suddenly the guy staggered, his mouth open in fear. He called the system and asked what it was. The blue board said that you need to run, since there was a violation number 8 in dimension. The guy staggered and grabbed his forehead with his hand, and Seong-hin ran up to him worriedly, asking if everything was okay. Removing his hand from his face, the guy said that, as he had said, the dungeons were full of dangerous surprises, and shouted for everyone to run as far as possible. The hunters looked up in shock. Pieces of stones began to fall from the buildings, and a cry was heard asking what was happening. Shang-han created a shield over Yujin, protecting him from falling rocks, and told him to be careful and stay behind it. The guy looked to the side and, activating resistance to fear, asked where his brother and Yerim were. Two hunters appeared above them and shouted that they had better get out of there now, and Hyena asked if it was an earthquake. Yerim, with her mouth wide open, screamed that where they were standing, something was rising from the ground. The guys turned around and looked at the cracked ground, shaking from the tremors. Everyone rushed out of there. Looking back at the flying stones, Hyuna asked in horror what was happening here. Suddenly, behind them, a huge gray monster poked out of the ground with its mouth slightly open. A huge stone frog landed. Opening her mouth, Hyuna raised her head up and said that she had never seen such a monster. Yuyan asked if he was sure that it was a monster because it was incredibly large. Frowning, Yujin said that it was definitely a monster. After calling the system and reading the information about the monster on the blue window, the guy said that it was Mountain Eater Bavar, an SS-class toad monster whose body is completely covered with impenetrable rocks. Hyoni looked at Yujin with interest as the others shouted that this dungeon was only in a class and asked what something like that was doing here. Opening his mouth, the blonde whispered that Eugen undoubtedly foresaw this. The guy with the cape fluttering in the wind looked at Eugen from behind and asked himself if this was not just a coincidence, then what else was he hiding? The little griffin got his head entangled in a towel and screamed. He flew around the room, and a guild employee with her hair in a ponytail tried to catch him and screamed for Blue to stop playing with the towels, while Chirpy squeaked from behind, attracting attention. The girl turned to the bird, saying that who would have thought that babysitting monsters would be so difficult. At that time the bird was knocking on the door to a closed room with a squeak. The girl opened the door, asking what it was and saying that Eugen was not in the room, and Chirpy, who ran into the room, stopped, looking at something in surprise. The bird stood in the room and looked around, squealed in tears. The girl consoled her that tomorrow he would return, but then ran after Blue, asking, "Is he doing it again?" The sad bird was left alone in the room and cried with a squeak. Her little muzzle was red and tears were streaming down her face. Suddenly Chirpy let out a loud squeak, spreading her wings, and the space next to her flickered with blue light. A blue flicker appeared in the air, next to which a system table began to form. A red circle with a pattern appeared in the middle of the blue whirlwinds. This L rank skill was called Dimension Master. The round vortex created an image of Eugen sitting astride Peace as Chirpy stared at it in surprise. Looking at the blue whirlwind, she let out a startled squeak. She took a step towards the whirlwind that fascinated her. Suddenly, a griffin fell right on top of her with a scream, causing the pin bird to squeal. The employee literally barged into the room asking the pet if everything was okay, and Blue made a surprise sound. The space shimmered blue in front of them. Behind this blue shine, high-ranking hunters and Eugen could be seen looking at the monster in the form of a huge turtle. Hyuna stood in front of the guy sitting on the lion and asked that this dungeon is only a rank. What is doing something like that here? The toad monster raised a huge paw into the air, and the huntress asked if they could even fight this creature. At least it looked pretty slow. The huge toad hit the ground with its paw so hard that debris flew around, and the hunters standing on the hill and looking at it seemed very small. The ground around the paw was covered in rubble and smoking. The monster moved towards the hunters, who were running away from her. Yerim screamed that she had only taken a step and was already able to inflict such damage. Turning to the monster, she suggested that everyone use their gate stones and leave from there, but Eugen, looking at her, said that no, they couldn't just leave her like that. What if there was a dungeon breakthrough and she crawled out into their world? Eugen remembered how a huge toad stood in the middle of the city with a helicopter flying next to it, which seemed very small. The guy thought that it actually happened a few years later in the original version of the world in rural China. A toad caused catastrophic damage just by crawling slowly. The Yu Haiyan, resolutely holding the sword in his hand, said that then they would have to give it their all. He shouted to his older brother to stay away, flying into the air, and Yerim, who jumped nearby, asked Seong-han to take care of him, to which Eugen shouted, trying to stop them. Yerim held her ice spear in her hands and thought that the icy sigh of a rank and the pale rain of S rank below the level would not even leave a scratch on this monster SS rank. The spear began to shine. White whirlwind surrounded it. The girl said that a day without a shadow is another matter. She will apply an SS boost 2 mana and fire skills. The girl thrust a spear into the ground, and a large dark shadow spread from it. She shouted that she had created all this for the head of the guild. Then it was up to him. Yu Yan decisively rushed forward along this shadow. His gaze burned, and a ball of violet flame appeared in his palm. He hovered over the monster, directing a huge stream of purple flame at it, spreading far around. Eugen looked at the blazing fire sitting on the pet next to the man and shouted that the black flames of SS rank should be enough. He advised his brother to hit the back of the neck. This is its weak point. The guy thought he already knew how to kill a turtle, especially with a team like this where they had the perfect combination of skills. Yu Yun struck the enemy with a swift movement of his sword. From the blow, a mark from the movement of the sword appeared on the turtle's neck, and that's all. The guild leader struck with his sword again, even harder. The guy thought that the whole point was that they were still in the moment. 5 years earlier, hunters didn't have an extra 5 years to get better equipment, higher stats, and more experience. Yu Yun looked at the monster with displeasure, and Hyuna, who came from behind, shouted for the young master to get out of the way. She said, "So the back of the neck. 1-hit kills is her specialty." The woman forcefully thrust a shining scarlet spear straight into the monster's neck, and fragments of the shell flew around. Only the tip of the spear entered the body. She cursed, saying that it was very difficult. The worst thing was different. The edges of the wound glowed red as she drew her weapon. The wound began to heal, healing. To the surprised cry of the hunter, Beaver can heal almost instantly. Hyena screamed in shock that if she had an SS rank spear, she would make a pincushion out of the monster. It seems it's time to take out her SS rank chains. Hyoni, holding out his hand with a golden chain, said that if they cannot pierce the skin. A golden chain entangled the body and mouth of the monster. Hyoni shone with golden fire, squeezing the monster's body with chains, and asked, "What about this?" Seong-hin and Yujin, who closed his eyes from the radiance, along with the fiery lion, looked at this, and the guy thought that this was madness. Even he could not defeat him alone. Seong-hin sighed in surprise, asking if it worked, and said that this was the first time the monster had reacted. Beaver opened his red eye and growled. Suddenly, he took a big leap forward, despite the chains. The hunters looked at this in horror and screamed. With a terrible roar, the toad jumped to another place. The earth was crumbling under the monster's paws. There was even a deep crack running along the ground, splitting the soil in two. The remains of buildings and columns collapsed, falling down. Hyoni stood next to the hunters, trying to come to their senses, and said that no, it seems they shouldn't anger this creature by making it jump like that again. Hyona annoyedly asked him if there were any other ideas on how to defeat the monster with one blow. Taking a closer look at the giant toad, she exclaimed for the others to look. It recovered in one hit. Frowning at the monster, she asked how they should kill it. Behind her, Yu-yun told his brother sitting on the beast that he needed to leave, to which he replied to listen. They could still destroy the monster if the hunters worked together. Yujin looked at his brother carefully. He presented a huge toad that had a red cross on its back that had to be hit, and said that simply using one skill after another would not pierce the hard skin. He said the best chance was to make a series of attacks and hit the weak spot on the neck. He looked at Yerim, who was floating next to him in the air, and asked again in surprise, and said that they would start with her, let her freeze the back of her neck. Turning to his younger brother, the guy said that immediately after he should apply heat. Hyan, he looked at them carefully and listened to the dialogue of the hunters. Yerim said that she understood how a cold glass mug can crack if hot water is poured into it. Hyan asked what happens, will they? Looking at the elder, the blonde asked, does such good information come with his skill as a beast master? To this, the guy turned around and replied that one could say so. Standing at peace, the guy turned to the woman, saying that she would step in next, to which Hyuna asked in surprise, did he seriously think this would work? She remembered how the wound from the blow on the monster's back had healed, and said that the guy had seen how quickly this creature was recovering. It would heal before they had time to carry out the next attack, if they missed the moment, even a little. Besides, they are not that, and worked hard as. The long-haired woman spread her hands, saying that they wouldn't be able to train either, unless he wanted to see this creature jump again, and they didn't have telepathy. To this, the guy asked, what if he said that it was possible? Everyone looked at the standing F rank and asked in surprise, what? Looking at the woman with determination, Yujin said that what she said was correct. The most important thing was to carry out a series of attacks at the perfect moment, but this meant that they would have to work as a single mechanism. The guy looked at the blue circle of the system element shining next to him. He said that this whole plan wouldn't be possible otherwise, but luckily for them, he could make it possible for the hunters. Yujin thought it would be nice to use something like an effective attack skill, but he couldn't ask. Standing surrounded by blue system symbols, he said that he was going to use his skill now. He looked at the yellow skill symbol with a chicken and chicks and thought that he was using the skill that he accidentally received yesterday. Looking at the others, Yujin waved his hand and said that yesterday he received a special team skill that should help improve their teamwork. Yu Hyan looked at his brother in surprise and asked again. He received a command skill, to which Yujin, calling up the system menu, answered with consent and said that he must have been able to fulfill the conditions to unlock it. He looked carefully at the shining menu table and thought that at least now the description was more detailed. Below the yellow picture of a hen with chicks was a description of the skill Terrifying Chick Commander. It said the following. Teacher guiding the stubborn awakened ones. The kids are so naughty, aren't they? Don't worry. If you use this skill, you will be able to unite several objects of influence. Round bottles with blue potions illustrated that, firstly, the skill depends on the level of intelligence and mana. Yujin drank the liquid while pointing his finger and told Yuyun to get Yuyun closer to Yerim. Secondly, the caster can take damage if the target of influence disables the synchronization attempt. A book with a picture of a hen and chicks appeared in front of the guy's palm, Surrounded by radiance, the guy told the others that he was using this skill now, and they needed to accept it. It was important. Holding the book in his hand, Yujin created glowing blue patterns at his feet with his other hand Yerim, and Yuyan looked in surprise as the same patterns appeared on the ground. Where they were standing, the system reported that the terrifying Chicken Commander skill has been activated. The girls and the guy's eyes glowed yellow. Yujin with yellow eyes saw in front of him windows with images of hunters, as if there was what they see with their own eyes. He opened his eyes in shock, realizing, and exclaimed to himself in surprise. He extended his hand forward, as if feeling the same hand of his brother nearby, and thought that he could feel their bodies. The brothers looked at their palm in the same poses, as if translucent, and Yerim looked at them in surprise. Yujin thought that he felt their bodies like his own, as if he knew in advance what they wanted to do. The guy thought that he understood what they would say, even if they themselves did not. The younger one looked at his palm and began to say that he couldn't feel it. Yujin said for him that there was no difference, and his brother looked at him in surprise. Yerim exclaimed in surprise, asking what happened now. Yujin held his hand over the book and happily said that great, now he will try to synchronize the two of them. Yu Yeon and Yerim looked ahead seriously, listening to the sensations. The symbols at their feet intertwined, and the hunters looked at each other in surprise. The girl said that it was both cool and creepy. Hyena looked at them and asked what happened. Yerim extended her hand with a spear forward, as if sensing the presence of a guy nearby, and said that it felt as if the body of the head of the guild had become part of her own. She could even predict his movements and balance their forces. Sharply hitting the head, who immediately reacted with a spear, she said, "That's it." Yujin covered his eyes from the rising wind, and Hyuna asked in surprise how it was that the tip of the spear came perfectly close to the sword. The tip of the spear made perfect contact with the tip of the sword, and the woman added in amazement that they did it without blinking an eye. How is this even possible? Encouraged, she pointed at herself and told him to do the same to her, to which Yujin, who was drinking the potion, told her to give him a second. He needed to recover. The guy said that her role is to destroy the toad skin. Once Yuyan does what is required of him, she will be able to minimize the D. Hyuna looked at him in admiration, happily asking that she could ride Peace. The woman was delighted, saying that how did he know that she had brought a saddle and even fire-resistant equipment, just in case. At this time, Yujin stroked the head of the disgruntled fiery lion, apologizing, and said that it was only this time. The guy thought about the third clarification of the use of the skill. Yujin reached into his inner pocket, telling her to take care of the pet, and said that he had something else for her. Hyuna turned around with the saddle in her hands and asked what exactly. The guy remembered the clarification that the skill is easier to use on objects of influence whom he takes on. With a cute wink, his fingers folded into a small heart, and said that his heart, he said that he loved Hyuna. Hyujin thought he would take this chance to make her his ward. They were already close enough that he could get out of such a situation by laughing it off. A critical failure occurred. Hyuna stood with the saddle in her hands, and a rainbow poured from her mouth, and the guy hastened to add that he was very grateful for everything she did for them, went with them, and so on. She was so kind to him, even when he kept yelling at her, and that's why. Hyuna looked at him with a smile and laughed, saying that it was so stupid. Shyly scratching her nose, she told the guy not to worry. His attitude helped her remember how harshly she was trained when she was still an athlete. His system reported that Hyuna responded to the code word and became a pupil. Yujin turned away in embarrassment and thought, well, guess he succeeded after all. He turned with a smile and said that they need it now, but he was interrupted. Hyoni stood in front of the brunette with his arms folded and said that it should be his turn now. The guy excitedly thought that this was definitely a tough nut to crack. He remembered that the fourth explanation stated that the higher the stats of an object, the more difficult it is to use a skill on it with respect and a stupid smile. Yujin asked if he had already mentioned that he also loved Hyoni, just like his brother, to which the blonde replied that after ever. The guy extended his hand forward and, looking with yellow eyes, asked not to reject his skill. Hyoni did not look at him, engulfed in a blue glow. He looked at the brunette with shining eyes. Yujin swayed in shock. He felt resistance. The system reported that the object refused his skill. The guy doubled over, coughing, and Hyunhee exclaimed in surprise, looking at him. Frowning at the blonde, Yujin said that they shouldn't do this, looking at him calmly. The guild leader said that he just slightly rejected him, and that's all. In response, the guy mentally cursed. Yu-yun ran up to them and asked in alarm what happened, and if everything was okay. Hyunhee threw his red coat over the guy's shoulders, saying with a grin that maybe at least this would help him stay whole, and the brunette said displeasedly that everything was fine. He only needed one assistant, Yujin held his hand to his mouth, feeling what the others were seeing: the toad, him from behind, him and his brother. He thought he was receiving visual information from 4S rank and peace hunters. Hard to handle, as if he were some kind of hub or filter, or a teacher trying to stage a school skit with. He covered one eye with his hand, thinking that maybe if he closed his eyes, it would feel better out loud. He told the hunters to hurry up, because he was not sure that he would have enough strength for long. Under a cloudy sky, a huge toad stood on the ground, and at a distance from it, on a rock, stood Shang Han with a bow in his hands. Yujin thought that he knew that they had to worry about the SS-ranked beast now, but their first priority was to make the S-ranked man. Shang Han looked at his opponent resolutely, clutching his bow in his hand. The guy thought that this is why he should strike the first blow. The man pulled the bowstring. He released the arrow, and it quickly flew out of the bow, leaving behind a bright trail and surrounded by a red glow. The arrow, small compared to the monster, easily flew off his back. The archer was upset. Yerim, holding a glowing spear in her hands, said that she assumed that there would not be even a small scratch left on it. Raising her weapon, she ran forward with a shout, thinking that since the first attack had been made, now it was up to her. Swinging her hand with a spear, the girl applied a mana boost. The system reported that the Day Without Shadow skill has been activated. She extended her hand upward. Dark swirls and frosty patterns spread from her weapon. The girl said that she would link it with another skill. The system reported that the Icy Breath was activated. Black shadow lines crawled across the toad's strong skin, screaming decisively. Yerim extended her hand with the weapon upward and said that she would concentrate all the cold energy at one point. Shining ice flows appeared around the tip of the spear. She said that she would make the spear thicker and sharper as possible. She shouted the command to the pale rain and screamed militantly. Surrounded by a blue glow, she flew at the monster, pointing her spear down. Huge white ice flows flying out from its tip. The beast's back was covered with a huge layer of ice. The girl enthusiastically shouted that he was completely frozen and ready. It was up to the head, who was already approaching with a sword. The system reported that Hermes shoes were used for teleportation. Yu Yun released a pillar of flame from his palm. Hovering above the monster, he directed all of his flames down towards him. The beast's skin became red hot, engulfed in flames. The Aram hovered sitting on her spear, and said in admiration that everything melted in a second. She had never seen this before. How strong is this heat? Standing nearby, Yujin, bent over, replied that he could barely breathe due to the general sensory information. Hyuna sat on Peace's back, next to the blazing flames, and shouted to the guy not to worry. She's strong enough to handle the fire. She needs to hit this thing while the shell is still soft, right? She looked forward with a confident smile, and said that right now was a great chance. Seong Han looked intently at the beast. Surrounded by flames, Yujin thought that the woman was right, that at the moment the shell was in a vulnerable state. But it was not time yet, just a little. The hunter's eyes glowed yellow. A bright purple flame engulfed the beast, gathering into a whirlwind. Yujin reasoned that they needed to wait until the flame died down to an acceptable level, but before the skin began the healing process. Yujin frowned, pressing his palm to his forehead, and ordered himself to think. He felt and imagined hyena riding a beast, and thought about Peace's speed and agility. Hyun kept using the attack, and the guy thought about the heat of the remaining flames passing through the younger senses. Hyun's back is standing, and the final moment when he must join the fight. A drop of blood fell onto the palm of the exhausted guy. The man took him by the forearm, and he was surprised. Yujin looked at the blonde, who grabbed his arm, holding him, and asked, "What is it?" Hyun held him back, saying that isn't it time for them to move out already? He thinks he can figure out when it's his turn, but for now let him focus on Hyuna. Yujin wiped the blood from his face when he heard the words that in this way the man would apologize for his disobedience, and replied that he could definitely become the teacher's pet. After materializing the golden chain, Hyun heard the guy tell him to hold tight because they needed physical contact to share the skill. Hyuna, riding a torturing lion, rushed towards the enemy. Yujin thought he needed the perfect moment. Considering speed, distance, and time remaining before the flame goes out, calculating every option, the perfect moment, Yujin shouted loudly now. The hunter on a fiery beast with a spear in her hands flew at the monster, and the guy, leaning on the blonde's shoulder, looked at it. The terrifying monsters that emerged from the portal filled the entire city, leaving behind only rubble. Yujin remembered how, in the very early days of the dungeon breakout, low-class monsters left a trail of destruction in his world. A hunter with various weapons is trying to defeat a huge black monster with tentacles behind his back. The guy realized that over time, along with complex dungeons, more and more formidable creatures began to appear. The special team skill, which depicts chickens, was obtained by the brunette when they teamed up to clear the dungeon together. S-class hunters stand in a circle, above which hands supposedly rise, controlling them like puppets. Eugen believes that if an equal person tries to control the thoughts and body of another, then at that moment, he will have a feeling of aggression and rejection. An F-rank beast sits on the blonde's head. Pulling his strands, the main character thinks that it feels much more harmless. Hyuna controls the flame lion with a smile on his face as they were able to carry out the first coordinated attack of the S-classes. Holding his mane with a spear in her hands, she loudly exclaimed to him to move forward. Hyuna raised her spear above her head with a menacing face as she shouted, "Let's take this chance." She stuck a spear into the stone, creating such a whirlwind around it that she was almost carried away. A bright pink light began to erupt from the impact site. Everything around turned into rubble, but P stubbornly remained in place while Hyena sat on him. Looking at what was happening, Yerem had tears of happiness running down her face. She proudly exclaimed that the girl had succeeded, despite being burned by the flames. Wreathed in fire, Hyuna laughs happily, with a crazy smile on her face. While riding a lion, she said it was an amazing feeling. Something swamp-colored began to appear under the concave spear. The girl was thrown to the side, and some liquid began to splash out from this place. Seeing what looked like a volcanic eruption, Hyuni told Eugen, who was being held in his arms at the time, that it was time for him to join too. When he followed down, the guy, putting his hand to his heart, asked the head not to worry, since he was using a bracelet, thanks to which the blonde would not be able to hold back. Hyuni, with a serious face, extended his hand forward to use his skill. At this point, Eugen started using Yerem's buffs. A system sign appeared, announcing the activation of the F-class veteran, as the brunette decided to add some extra punch. Seeing that everything around was shrouded in golden chains, the blonde was surprised when Eugen used an attack skill that adds a double strike. The monster, covered with green scales, began to scream, sticking out its tongue. The brunette covered himself with his palm, while everything around was shrouded in targets. Out of breath, I thought it was a very overwhelming force. Hyoni opened his mouth when he saw what was happening. A slight smile appeared on his face. Sitting on the dais, the monster cried out pitifully. A black hole appeared on his back, covered with green scales. The monster's eyes turned white from such a strong attack. The frog-like beast could not stand on its feet. While the breathless Hyuna sat on the fiery lion, Yerem, smiling, asked if they really won. Everything around began to collapse. As the monster fell, the ground began to crumble, causing Yerem to jump. Hyuna exclaimed loudly, asking her to be careful with the debris. While the guys ran away, Seong-han remained in place, arms outstretched. At this moment, Eugen shouted that he needed to leave. A system sign appeared in front of the man, informing him that the conditions for raising the level had been met. The man stopped the falling debris, which surprised the guys. A notification has appeared about increasing the level of Seong-han's stats and skills. While pieces of stones were flying away, Eugen, who was watching from the side, leaned on Hyunyi. He exclaimed loudly that it was simply amazing. The guy raised his hand to his face, after which he suddenly began to fall, without finishing his thought, and blood flowed from his nose. Sweat dripping all over his face. Rolling his eyes, he said that he would take a short nap since he had no energy left, asking them not to fight until he woke up. Ryujin bowed his head and began to fall, but was stopped by Hyoni. The green monster lay flat, kicking up dust all around as the first coordinated attack was successful. Hyuna's eyes began to light up with delight, despite the fact that the effect of the skill had ended. She joyfully exclaimed that they had the best cat, inviting him to come live with her. The others were surprised to see the girl hugging Peace. Clearly dissatisfied with such closeness, the main character suggested that the sudden collision with a terrible enemy, against whom she had to spend all her strength, liberated her. Irim, who stood next to the perplexed Yuyun, said that the girl sharply hit the guy's palm with her hand as a sign of victory. They lowered their gaze, looking at each other, because they did not understand what had happened. The embarrassed partners turned in opposite directions. Holding their guns in their hands, Eugen believes that this happened because fighting hand in hand created a bond between people who dislike each other. Seong-hin runs excitedly, so much so that his mouth opened when he shouted Hyun-hee's name. His eyes widened at what he saw. In front of him, a lifeless brunette lay on the ground, with Hyunhee sitting next to him. The blonde looked at his palm with a surprised face. He was able to enjoy the feeling of doubling his strength. Putting his hand to his mouth, a small smile appeared on him after he realized that such power could always belong to him. In a room illuminated by a bright blue light, the head of the system, with long ears, stood slumped in front of the control panel. She cried out pitifully that this creature had come for Yujin. Her teammate standing behind her tried to calm her down. The head reported that the measurements were suddenly distorted, as the beast they had been expecting only 5 years later appeared. An assistant with horns on her head asked her partner in Volf clothing whether recovery would take a long time, to which she asked to wait for her. Saying that there was still a little time left, the head of the system burst into tears. While the assistant was busy with work, she asked loudly if they th. The Volf-skinned man asked her to calm down, explaining that the attempt was made from the world of sweets, so her guesses were wrong, because those people were working from the outside. The assistant behind the controls turned his head towards the head. The girl with the horns had a worried head in front of her, as she said that someone in the world tried to use the teleportation skill to get to him. She warily asked her who could have done this. Holding her chin, she looked down and assumed that this was done by someone with at least an SSS class skill, or even legendary. An image of the murdered Bavar appeared on the screen, seeing which the head called her assistants and looked at the picture. She was surprised and said that they had already defeated this monster so quickly. The man in Volf's clothing came up to the screen and, raising his finger, said that he thought they would tinker with him longer, because for this they would receive a worthy reward. The assistant with the horns took a closer look and said something was wrong. She saw a photo of Yujin's lifeless body lying next to a blonde man looking at him with a devilish smile on his face. Hyunhee asked the guy who he really was. The brunette is constantly surrounded by animals, which is why the blonde assumed that he had the only skill as a master of beasts, so he decided to wait until the end of the contract. He thought that at the same time he believed that Yujin was hiding a lot, because he behaved in the dungeon as if he. Looking at his black glove palm, Hyunhee said that the brunette shared with him a skill that doubles damage. An ominous aura began to emanate from him. He remembered the time when he had such power. While Yujin lay with his eyes closed, the blonde looked at him and wondered why he was human, since in his place Hyunhee would have acted differently. He threw it over his shoulder when a worried Yu Yun began to approach them, whom Seong-hin tried to stop. The guy asked if his brother was okay. The brunette opened his mouth in surprise when he was interrupted by Yu Yun, who asked him if he could leave it to him, with one hand confidently supporting Yujin as he lay on his shoulder. The blonde said that he would feed him 3 times a day and provide everything he needed for the best care. His green eyes sparkled as he added that he was taking it with him. Hyuna turned around and saw Hyunhee hanging Yujin's lifeless body over himself. The guy got so angry that he couldn't say anything, but the girl with a surprised face asked if the blonde was serious. At that moment, an enraged Yerim came running. Holding a spear in her hands, she threateningly told the head that this was not funny, asking him to return it to them calmly, since the agency just needed to rest. Seong-hen grabbed his bow tightly and cast a stern look at Hyunhee. Standing next to the fiery lion, Yu Hyun took the hilt of the sword and demanded that the man give him the brunette. Hyunhee, throwing his head back, thought with a sly look, maybe kill them. Even though he was standing alone against several, he decided to simply destroy everyone, blaming the SS class monster, since the double damage buff was still active. After which I realized that it would be very easy to eliminate MKC and Hyuna. The girl sharply thrust her spear into the ground, breaking it into fragments. She stood in a menacing pose and extended the weapon in his direction when she had shouted enough. Yerim was scared when she saw that the girl was very angry. Hyuna said that she would finish him off if he did anything strange, while the others restrained themselves so as not to hurt the elder. Hyunhee looked intently into her red eyes. She told him not to be greedy, considering Yujin to be his toy. Otherwise someone would simply break him. The brunette began to hang from the shoulder of the guy, who reported that the bracelet was out of order. Hyunhee resigned, carried his body to the girl in his arms when he said that it seemed that he was in the minority. With a smile on his face, looking at the ground, the blonde wanted to say something, but did not finish. He attacked Yu Hyun, who was standing still, holding the hilt of his sword. The guy broke the chain with his weapon when Hyunhee reported that he had returned the brunette safe and sound. Yu Hyun concentrated using his skill, asked him if he decided to attack him due to the lack of fireproof equipment that his brother wanted to get. Standing opposite his opponent, the guy swung his shoulder strongly as he decided to check something. Hyan he looked with a confident look at the frightened Ju Hyan. Suddenly, a block of ice appeared in front of the brunette, which surprised him. They turned around because they were interrupted by Yerim, who shouted stop. Holding her trident in one hand, with an enraged look, she loudly asked if they remembered that they needed to keep the Ajushi safe. Supporting Yujin by the shoulder, Hyuna threw aside her burgundy cloak as she told Hyun to grow up already, because the guy is half his size. While the brunette ran past the block, she turned to the young master and asked him to take his brother already. Taking off his swamp-colored cloak, Yuyun distanced himself from the blonde and told him to stay away. He replied that he was unlikely to be able to do this, since he had become his big fan. When the brunette turned his head to the side, Hyunhee, throwing a menacing look, Hyuna screamed that she was telling them to stop. The young master began to cover Yujin, who was still unconscious, with his cloak. Seonghin told him not to be so nervous. Meanwhile, the girl assumed that her brother would be safe since Hyunhee liked him so much. Thinking it was for the best, opposite them, in the distance, stood a blonde man next to whom Yam grumbled defiantly. Yujin, lying on his clothes, made a face when he heard the girl call him more impudent. He shouted stop fighting. A black portal appeared in front of them, illuminating it with a purple light. When the brunette said that they needed to wrap up and get out, that's how they cleared this dungeon. Having learned about what had happened, the excited employees worked with all their might, as the guys actually set the entire internet on edge. A huge number of letters were written about this, because the appearance of an SS-class beast in an A-class dungeon shocked the whole world, causing the association to plunge into complete chaos, although some details were hidden for security reasons, fearing public protests. All the news channels and websites were broadcasting that Seong Han had become an S-class. Even this was enough to keep the world buzzing about the purge. The girl leaned on the table with her hand, where strands of red hair lay. Entering the dressing room, the assistant was surprised, so she opened her mouth when she reminded her boss about the photo shoot tomorrow. She saw Hyan-ho standing in front of the mirror with his temples shaved. The girl's face turned blue as she looked at the departing boss when she asked him to tell them to be happy about the top part of their hair that had been left behind. Hyuna, holding her jacket over her shoulder with one hand, said that now was not the time to worry about this. Change is coming soon. Today, the building with panoramic windows was illuminated by sunlight. The hero believes that the appearance of mounts, the existence of a blacksmith, as well as the appearance of the first team of S-classes will change a lot. Such changes can rebuild the foundation of the system. While looking at the scenic view outside the window, Hyunhee told someone on the phone that plans had changed. He threw his head to the side and with a grin on his face, told his twin brother Valsius to get ready to come to Korea. The interlocking brass gears of change began to turn. Meanwhile, the multi-story hospital, surrounded by greenery, has become the center of these changes. Something began to squeak throughout the entire ward. An animal sat near the face of the awakened Yujin, which continued to scream right in his ear. He hit him on the cheek so that the brunette was pressed to the pillow. Rising from the bed, he saw a white creature jumping on the blanket holding his forehead. Yujin asked Sherpai if she was hungry. The guys who had been in the room all this time were moved. Embarrassing the brunette, they loudly exclaimed woke up. The guy dressed in hospital clothes looked at his hand and asked what they were doing here, remembering that he had passed out in the dungeon. Awkwardly holding the back of his head, covered with a blanket, the guy said that it seems he slept longer than he thought, to which Myungwoo shouted angrily for 2 days. Giving Seong Han a menacing look that made him feel uneasy, the guy said that they couldn't even save his brother, even if all 4 of them had S-class, to which the man replied that he was fine, according to the doctor. Sherpai climbed onto Yujin's head, next to whom stood Myungwoo, devouring the guys with his eyes, after which they asked him for forgiveness. What was happening made the brunette happy, as he saw that the blacksmith was now keeping everyone in fear. Yujin took the squeaker in his hands and awkwardly looked at Myungwoo, who said that she cried a lot, which is why they asked permission to bring her to his room. After which he offered to take her away so that he could rest, but the brunette said that everything was fine. He began to stroke the white furry creature with his hands as he asked her if she missed him. Yujin decided to open the list with students because he wondered what about Seonghan's level. A system plaque appeared in front of him, displaying photographs of those under his care. He was happy when he realized that Seonghan now has S-class. In the same list, the brunette saw peace. He jumped out of his bed, causing Myungwoo to worry as he realized that the flame lion had become an S-class as well. Because of what he saw, the blacksmith decided to call him by name. Yujin tried to get up from the bed where the guys were standing around. He said that he needed to see peace because he had already matured, but Myungwoo said that the doctor asked to stay in bed until tomorrow. In turn, Seong-han added, "The hospital bed on which the brunette lies is surrounded by a curtain." He asked the guys if he had gone to the Yuyan dungeon. Seong-han stood looking at Yerim worriedly when the guy, remembering the mention of clearing the S-class dungeon, asked him why he wasn't with him, to which the man said, "You see." A drop of sweat began to run down the girl's face when she hesitantly answered that only the chapter with peace went to the dungeon. Yujin widened his eyes at what he heard and asked what. The man remembered how the three of them stood with a fiery lion right in front of the entrance to the dungeon. The touching guy said that he had never been to a cleanup operation with peace. The guys got scared when the fiery lion transformed, becoming much stronger. They called him. His partners surrounded him with surprised faces, thinking that the lion was cool. Now Yuya asked what was going on. Meanwhile, Hyuna clarified when he managed to grow so much. The guy with widened eyes lowered his head and said that he had finally grown up. Peace began to look evil as he had large fangs. The guy, in whose eyes his reflection is visible, looked closely at the fiery lion. He used his skills to block the way for the scared kids. They opened their mouths and looked at him. Some even turned blue with fear. The partners, not understanding what was happening, called the head. Yu Hyan, behind whom stood the S-class piece, told them to stay, because only the two of them would go on this cleanup. The guy wrinkled his face in anger, so much that all his muscles tensed. While Yujin was sitting in his hospital bed, immersed in his thoughts, and Myungwoo ran off to work, Yerim asked him if he had calmed down. The guy asked her how he could be calm, because the gates were closed, which is why they wouldn't be able to get the guys back now. The brunette remembered how 10 minutes ago he threw a tantrum at his students who were trying to restrain him. He tried to jump out of bed, but Yerim stopped him when the guy said that he still doesn't understand what Seong-han was thinking about them. Meanwhile, the man decided to calm him down with the help of technology for laboring mothers. Drops of sweat began to run down the guy's face out of anger as he understands that clearing the S-class dungeon requires at least 10 days, which is why they may not get enough sleep. Standing next to the girl, Seong-han closed his hands pleadingly and said that the dungeon seemed normal to him. He also believes that everything will be okay with them, because they have the gate stone. Yerim also asked him not to worry so much about it, and asked the brunette what awards he received. Yujin's face turned blue from what he heard, since he does not understand what award she is talking about. Showing off a magic crystal earring, she revealed that it was SS grade equipment that she received for defeating Bavar. Vermid Queen earrings, deep blue waves, made of 4 blue magic crystals. The girl said that they not only increase the level of mana of intelligence, but also give complete freedom of maneuver in the water, and also thanks to them, her efficiency will increase by 30% when using skills related to water and ice in water. The guy jumped up from his bed with a surprised face when he said that she would be absolutely invulnerable in the aquatic environment. Yerim agreed with him, since thanks to them she would calmly destroy all the underwater dungeons, thanks to which she would quickly pay off the remaining half of her. Thinking of this, a wide smile appeared on her face. Her thoughts about the huge amount of money began to crumble when she remembered that she would go into debt again due to the purchase of new equipment. Hearing this, Yujin realized that she had a long journey ahead of her. Holding her head, she began to run around the ward, but despite all this, the brunette is glad that she is growing so slowly, but surely. Now she is constantly surrounded by partners, so the brunette believes that, unlike the S-classes who ruled alone, she will grow up surrounded by caring sunbees. While the guy was flying in his dreams, the guys next to him were whispering, looking at him. The girl realized that she had managed to distract him. When the guy was looking for something on his profile, the man said that he received the gate stone, while Yurimi was dying of curiosity. Yujin found that something SS grade had appeared on his profile. Seeing this, the girl was happy, because he also had strong equipment. The guys were surprised that the whole room began to be illuminated with blue light. The nameless Demon King's copper old water wheel appeared in front of them. The brunette held it in his hands with a surprised face when the girl asked him what it was. He said that it was an old wheel once used by the Demon King. The guys imagined the role in demons sitting near the spindle. When Seong-han suggested that he used it for a spinning wheel, the girl thought that this was a rather peaceful hobby for him. She decided to put this wheel on the guy's head, thinking that it should be worn that way. But Yujin believes that it is most likely an item, not equipment. Holding the wheel above his head, which Sherpai had climbed onto, he thought that the system had deliberately given him this reward. That is why he decided to check with them about this when he went to the dungeon again. At this moment, the guy became sad. as he remembered that his partners were alone in the S-class dungeon. His screams could be heard throughout the hospital. He again scolded Xiang Han, who again tried to calm him down. From the window of the brunette's chamber, one could see a beautiful tree. He decided to look at his profile when a man disturbed him and asked if he was sleeping. Approaching him, the man made a surprised face when he said that the guy was sitting in some kind of prostration. Just at that moment, the guy was checking how things were going with those two in the dungeon using his skill. Standing up, he grabbed the TV remote when Xiang Han guessed that he had noticed an early symptom of dementia. Flatly refusing, Yujin said that he simply couldn't sleep, so he decided to watch TV. He turned on the channel where the girl was telling the news that Hunter Xiang Han, who had renewed his contract with the Abyss, would be promoted to the position of deputy guild leader within this month. With his eyes wide, the brunette jumped out of bed and asked him if he would become deputy head. He said that he was chosen for this position because Yerim is still in high school, even though she is also S-class. From what he heard, the guy's eyes sparkled, so much so that he opened his mouth. With a smile on his face, Yujin took his hand and said that he was the best candidate for this position and asked him to take care of his brother, for which the man thanked him, after which the guy suggested throwing a party in honor of his promotion. Lowering his head, he embarrassedly touched his face and said that many people had already congratulated him, adding that he even received a bouquet from Hanshin. Hearing this, the guy smiled and asked him again because Minju from this guild was known for his hostility towards Seonghan. Standing with his jacket unbuttoned, he became embarrassed as he revealed that he once worked at Hanshin, surprising Yujin. He remembered the moment when they were drinking coffee, looking at each other, after which the man asked the guy. He knew that this guild was once part of the Hanshin group conglomerate. He also said that he and Minju were colleagues back then. The company executives patted him on the shoulders, inviting him to marry after awakening, saying that he would receive all the support as the chairman's son-in-law. Just at that moment, his partner awakened as an S-class. The brunette opened his mouth wide as Xiang Han looked at him and said that he eventually married the daughter of the chairman, thanks to which he became the head of the guild. The man became sad and, lowering his head, admitted that since then Minju had been afraid of him, which made him feel awkward around him. Yujin, imagining that he was sitting with glasses and eating popcorn, realized that his story was similar to a plot from a drama. Inspired, he rose from his bed and assumed that Minju was afraid because he himself wanted to become the husband of the daughter of the head of the guild, to which the man reminded that he was only in a class then. He remembered reading the letter while holding a bouquet of roses. Just at that moment, he received a congratulation in which they wished him to remain forever in the abyss. In Seonghan's hands was a piece of paper on which he was called a devoted servant. The guy hit the cabinet next to the bed when, holding his head, he realized that he was right. Meanwhile, the man thinks that it's good that this happened because there is one less threat to the abyss. Hearing this, the guy removed his hand from his face as he was surprised by his words. Yujin remembered how Minju stood in a black suit, bowing his head as he realized that he was not going to keep them under control. Despite the fact that there were 3 S-classes in his guild, Xiang Han said that his former colleague would not expand the influence of his guild because he is not a fan of. Looking at the smiling pupil, who lowered his head, the brunette realized that he put their guild above his personal feelings at that moment. The man said that he was happy with the way things were now, despite the fact that others were saying that he had been kicked out. Remembering how he fought in the dungeon with the guys, he admitted his reluctance to become the head of the guild because he believes that the role of an assistant is more suitable for him. Inspired, Xiang Han raised his hand in a fist as he promised that he would do his best as he wished to continue supporting Yujin. The brunette remembered his last trip to the dungeon when his partner tried to quietly take care of his comrades. He believes that even as an S-class, Seonghan will become a reliable team player. Daki Bai appeared on the windowsill while the brunette, looking at the man, admitted that he was glad that he would be next to his brother. The spirit said he knew the reference about the watchman. Taking hold of the blanket, Yujin widened his eyes as he did not expect to see Doki Bai. The creature said that his boss had woken up. The spirit held a red package in his hand, smiling. He said that he had brought hotels, which he himself would eat. Looking at Doki Bai sitting on the windowsill, a drop of sweat ran down the man's face as he believes that he is dangerous, but the brunette calmed him down, calling him his friend. Handing him a tin of food, Yujin confessed that he loved him since he came all this way for him. At that moment, he remembered that he had already influenced the spirit, so he decided to inquire about the progress with the long-distance teleportation skill. A system sign appeared near the smiling spirit, who began to eat the canned food, informing him that he was an unfinished species. Seeing that the spirit had bitten off the Sherpai, the guy opened his mouth, not understanding why he was doing this. Meanwhile, the next tablet appeared, which informed him that for his development he needed an object corresponding to the essence of the unfinished species. The guy lowered his head and remembered that Dakabai was born from a watermill. It dawned on him that in order to develop, he needed exactly the wheel that he received as a reward for his victory over Bavar. The guy showed the spirit a blue-lit wheel when he realized that it was for his development that the system gave such a reward. He asked him if he needed it. Dakabai took the wheel in his hands and began to carefully examine it. When Yujin revealed that he received it as a reward, the spirit realized that this was an ancient water wheel that belonged to the Demon King, so it was even older than him. The brunette was surprised when the creature sitting on the windowsill was able to determine the name of the object. A shimmering sunset had already appeared outside the window. Dakabai asked the guy if the Demon King with big horns was really scary, to which he received a positive answer. Yujin smiled awkwardly, laughing at him as the spirit declared that he was the Demon King. From now on, the guy believes that he cannot change his appearance so easily. Meanwhile, the guys became scared when they saw that the spirit began to transform. In the room, which began to be enveloped in purple light, a frightened Shang Han does not understand what is happening. Seeing how the man's body was wrapped in dark loops, the blue brunette asked Dakabai what he had done. Huge horns appeared on the spirit's head. In the scarlet light, the spirit flapped its demonic wing. He looked at them furiously in his new guise when he became the Demon King, believing that there was nothing more terrible than him. Beads of sweat ran down the guy's face. His eyes widened in surprise when he realized that the creature had become a demon, which they had never seen even after 5 years. Illuminating everything around with a black light, the spirit soared above the frightened brunette, after which he called himself the King of Demons. Yujin believes that the system was wrong in its action. When Dakabai began to attack the brunette, he hid behind a shield, not understanding what was happening. While he was defending himself from the demon's attack with Sherpai, the guy realized that he was also SS class, which is why he assumed that he was stronger than Bavar. Seeing Shang Han trying to get out of captivity, Yujin said that Bavar was at least humble. The guy grabbed his head, standing behind the shield, when he saw that Dakabai considers himself a big and scary Demon King. Beads of sweat ran down his face. He realized that this monster would turn the hospital into ruins, since even Xiang Han was unable to resist it. Hiding behind the protection, he lowered his gaze, because he does not understand how he remained in perfect order, because the shield from the earrings is only B class. Near the King of Demons, the captive pupil was hanging when the brunette realized that the spirit had not touched the area around him, despite its powerful energy, with which it was capable of destroying this chamber. Looking at his hand, on which Sherpai lay, Yujin assumed that one of the furry creature's abilities had not saved him. Among the students, there was still a photo of Dakabai, despite the fact that he became the Demon King. The brunette got so angry that all his muscles tensed when he realized that the spirit still saw him as a granny. That's why Yujin called him a naughty little imp. While holding the peace toy, he caught Dokibai's attention when he yelled at him for making a mess. The demon jumped out of fear as the guy started beating him with a stick, calling him a bad demon who needed to be put under house arrest for a week. Defending himself from his attacks, the spirit, transformed into a demon, asked the boss whether he considered him not scary at all in this form. While playing with a stick with a ball at the end, Yujin told him that in his previous form he was 100 times scarier. Having said this, he decided to divert his attention, since the spirit was still not indifferent to practical jokes. Keeping away from him, Dakabai was reminded of how the creature caused Mangwu and Han to faint. The spirit and Yujin, who was blue with fear, looked at the captive Xianghan. At this point, Dakabai asked him if the others were afraid of his transformed form. The brunette hinted to the man to play along with him in order to calm the spirit. Towering over the blue guy and the demon, Xiang Han also said that the spirit was much scarier in its previous form. Then he explained that he was only scared now because of Yujin, who might be in danger. Dakabai calmed down, looked at his hands, and asked them again if they really thought he was much worse in his previous form. Seeing this, the guy realized that his plan was working. Along with the screaming Sherpai, they surrounded him as the brunette reiterated that he was much scarier. In turn, Xiang Han confirmed his words, recalling that people fainted at the sight of him. While Dakabai sat with his mouth open in disbelief, they continued to say that they had never seen such a chilling mass of absolute horror in their lives. A smile appeared on the demon's face, allowing his only two teeth to be visible. As they begged him not to kill them, he replied that he would no longer be the Demon King. The guys looked in surprise at how Dokubai was happy, raising his hands up. Seong-hin stood in shock. He noticed the black loops letting go of him at this moment. He clarified whether the spirit was normal, since the fog began to dissipate. Sherpai sat on the head of the surprised brunette, who asked the man what he meant by normal. Dokubai began to transform again, losing its wings and large horns. A system sign appeared, announcing that he was now the King of Yun. The Demon King's mask shattered. Now the spirit has turned into a blonde guy with an ancient wheel hanging from his belt. Blue-eyed Yun is wearing a blue cape. With a smile on his face and his arms outstretched, he announced that he had reincarnated as King Takabe. A surprised Seong-hin sat next to Yujin, who believes that the spirit has evolved. The man asked him if everything would be okay now. Holding a pendant with an ancient wheel over his hand, Yun said that there was still a piece of the Demon King's energy left in this thing. When this item began to glow, the spirit promised that everything would be okay, because after the transformation, he was much stronger than the demon. Someone knocked on the trashed hospital room, asking if everything was okay. Meanwhile, Yun told the guys about a new skill that he wants to show them. Xiong-hun excitedly walked to the door when the brunette asked to show them off. In front of the nurse, the man asked if he could leave him alone with this creature. As the spirit began to play with Sherpai behind him, Yujin confidently replied that there was nothing to worry about now since Takabe do not harm people.